Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from today. And welcome to this day 3 of our 5-day University of Michigan Africa Week event. My name is Andries Coetzee. I am a professor of linguistics here at University of Michigan, and I'm also the director of the African Studies Center here at the university. Most of my research focuses on issues of language and identity in the complex post-apartheid South African society. And that means that I get to collaborate often with both colleagues and students and also speech communities back in Africa, South Africa specifically. And through my work at the African Studies Center, I've also been really fortunate that it has allowed me to remain engaged with the continent as we work to support all of the various of Michigan's relationships with institutions of higher education and other institutions on the continent. Let me start by expressing a heartfelt thank you to everyone participating in Africa Week, including the many individuals zooming into this meeting from all over the world, University of Michigan students, staff, and faculty, and participants listening in from elsewhere. We have over 700 people who registered to participate in Africa Week, and over the first 2 days, we've already had more than 450 unique visitors, participants in this event. Not only is there a large number of participants in Africa Week, but they also represent a wide range of countries, in fact, more than 30, including participants from the United States, many countries in Africa, but then also Germany, Finland, Spain, the UAE, Korea, India, Canada, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and more. It's really wonderful to have such a global audience. And it's also a testament to the important place that Africa occupies on the global stage at this moment in history. Let me also say thank you to the University of Michigan team who helped put together this event. This includes my 2 main co-organizers for the event, Valeria Bertacco from the Provost Office, whom you met yesterday, and Brody Remington from the University Development team that you will meet on Friday at the closing. And then also thank you to the rest of the team at the African Studies Center who helped a lot putting this together, and specifically my colleague there, Henrique Floresbos, who worked closely with us to put together the various panels of this event. And then also the team from University Development and Events, who's running the whole scene behind the scenes, putting together this fairly complex and massive international Zoom event. Over the first 2 days of Africa Week, we have focused on themes of health, the economy, and technology, and both the challenges and the opportunities that these present in the African context. Today, our focus will be on themes of higher education, training, and heritage. And our first panel this morning specifically will explore the theme, the role of academic exchange programs between Africa and the United States, and the role that these play in building sustainable, equitable, lasting international relationships. In this panel, we will be joined by colleagues representing Africa-based consortia who run exchange programs between Africa and the US, and also colleagues from the University of Michigan who will bring the perspective from a North American institution involved in these exchange programs. We will also be joined by a representative from the MasterCard Foundation who will bring the perspective of funders who participate in these kinds of exchange programs. Our second panel for today will explore questions surrounding the reclamation and repatriation of African heritage. And in any conference such as this that is focused on transatlantic relationships, we would be remiss if we did not consider the exploitative colonial history that has shaped much of the North's engagement with Africa over the past several centuries. And specifically is still influencing and shaping the kinds of relationships between Africa and the North, and how heritage is represented in our cultural and governmental and educational institutions. In this panel, we will hear from museum curators and cultural activists from Africa who are really leading voices in the global conversation about reclamation of heritage. And we will also hear from two groups here at the University of Michigan, both of whom are involved in different projects about the reclamation and making accessible of African heritage. But before we delve into these two panel discussions, we are starting today with a virtual fireside chat between Dr. Joe Kolars, the Senior Associate Dean of Education and Global Initiatives at our medical school, and Dr. Leah Tadesse, the Ethiopian Minister of Health. Drs. Kolars and Tadesse come a long way, having worked together here at Michigan as colleagues, and also as partners in the relationship between Michigan and the various medical, educational, and training institutions in Ethiopia. Their conversation this morning will explore themes related to models of equitable collaboration, the role of education and training activities in such collaborations, and given their areas of expertise, I'm sure they will also venture into topics related to global health. Joe Kolars is the Senior Associate Dean of Education and Global Initiatives at the Michigan Medical School. He's also the Josiah Macy Jr. Professor of Health Professions Education and Professor of Internal Medicine. Joe's career has been dedicated to medical education and global health. After earning his MD from the University of Minnesota in 1982 and then completing postgraduate training here at University of Michigan, he joined the faculty of Michigan and stayed here until 1996 when he took on the challenge of establishing a Western-based healthcare system in Shanghai, working closely with a university in Shanghai. He then returned to the United States and took up a faculty position at the Mayo Clinic before he returned to the University of Michigan again in 2009 to take on his current position as Senior Associate Dean. Dr. Kolars has extensive experience in the domain of global public health. Between 2007 and 2012, he worked closely with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to, among other things, establish educational and research partnerships between medical schools in North America and in sub-Saharan Africa. Much of his global work has focused on and continues to focus on Africa. And in 2020, Dr. Kolars assumed yet another leadership role here at Michigan by becoming the inaugural director of our newly formed Center for Global Health Equity. Dr. Kolars is a passionate advocate for global health and specifically for the role of medical education in this domain. Dr. Leah Tadesse became the Minister of Health for Ethiopia in March 2020, just as COVID was grinding the world to a standstill. It is not an easy job and certainly not an easy time to take on the job of being at the helm of a national health system. But there are few people as well prepared and as well qualified to do a job as difficult as this as Dr. Tadesse. She earned her medical degree at Jimma University in Ethiopia before specializing after that in obstetrics and gynecology at Addis Ababa University. And after completing her studies, she held several leadership positions in health education and management, including serving for 7 years as the CEO and vice provost of St. Paul's Hospital Millennium Medical College in Addis Ababa, and also acting as the program director for a USAID project on maternal and child survival in Ethiopia. In 2015, we were fortunate here at the University of Michigan that Dr. Tadesse joined us here as our executive director of the Center for International Reproductive Health Training, a position that she held until she returned to Ethiopia in 2018 to take on position as Ethiopia State Minister of Health, and then, as I've mentioned last year, becoming the Minister of Health of Ethiopia. Joe and Leah, thank you very much for joining us today, and we're looking forward to listening in on your conversation.
Great. Well, thank you, Andres. My congratulations to Team Michigan, and a warm welcome to those of you from around the world, particularly from our colleagues in Africa. I'm so excited to be in this conversation with my friend and colleague, Minister Tadesse. And if I was being proper, as we should always be with our colleagues, particularly in Africa, I would always be referring to her as Minister Tadesse. But Leah, I hope I can call you by our friendship name, Leah, as I know you will call me Joe, because that's how we first became friends years ago back in Ethiopia. Leah, I wonder if we could start. I know there are a number of students who are listening in. You know, sometimes people hear our pedigrees that Andres just talked about, some of our mileposts. But often learners want to understand, what were we thinking when some of the decisions came up? So could you go back to your student days a little bit? What were you thinking? What were some of the drivers and decision points? You know, did you decide in high school you wanted to be the Minister of Health? I'm so inspired by your position right now. You're overseeing the health of a country with over 115 million people, with such a deep and storied culture. What decisions and what unfolded on your path that brought you to your position that kind of was recognized by some of those mileposts that Andres had referenced? Could you speak a little bit about that, please?
Thank you so much, Joe. So I will call you Joe.
Please.
And it's really truly a pleasure to be in this Africa Week panel and this fireside chat, especially with you, Joe, with all the long-standing relationship we have with the two institutions. And coming back to the question, it is definitely interesting to look back at all the decision points. And going back, I actually, as a child, I've always wanted to be a physician. Never thought of being a minister. But since I was I think a little child, I was always firm on my wanting to be a doctor, physician. And fortunately, I went to medical school, and but I didn't have much of the idea of where my track would go, even in terms of specialty. It was when I was a clinical year, the first clinical year or the fourth year of my medical school, when I started my rotations in the clinical attachments. My OBGYN rotation really had a big impact on me. I was trained in Jimma University, which is southwest, around 300 kilometers away from Addis. It serves a large population, catchment population, with, of course, access problems. So I was seeing many women coming with complications of labor or abortion or different maternal and gynecologic problems. And really, the intervention we did when it was saving lives, it was very gratifying. And of course, losing lives was also another side of it, which was very tough. But I was really emotionally attached to that attachment. So after that, I made the decision while I was in clinical, my first clinical rotation, to continue on women's health, maternal health, and similar. So after I graduated, of course, we, as in Ethiopia, we initially practiced as general practitioners before we joined a residency program. So after practicing 1 year of general practice, I joined residency in OBGYN in Addis Ababa University. And that was really, the 4 years of residency were also a year that it was a lot of learning, but also truly gratifying in terms of service as well. But it also, I was kept on being drawn into the system problems within the facilities I was working at. When, although I was in one university, we did rotations in different hospitals, and the challenge of the patient care were also drawing me to be engaged in some of the improvement work. And after I finished my residency, of course, I went back to practice. I was working at that time at the Federal Police Force Hospital. But after maybe around a year after that, I had the opportunity to connect with the Minister of Health at the time, Dr. Tedros, whom you know very well, who's the current Director General of WHO, because of some presentation I did on our society. So that led to me to be offered to lead the St. Paul Hospital, who was at that time just in establishing a new medical school. It was just a hospital for many years, and then it was establishing a medical school. So it was a huge responsibility. I was just out of a year out of OBGYN residency with not so much leadership experience, but I had the passion. So I took the challenge and took the role of CEO of St. Paul, which was on the process of becoming a medical school. So I joined that process, which was a tough journey, but really a truly gratifying one as well in that process, which, so in a few years, it became St. Paul Hospital Millennium Medical College, which is a full-fledged medical school. And that was another opportunity to also connect with a lot of partners. And it was I joined that in 2007, and the school launched in 2008. And 2 years later, we're still doing medical school, but we had the aspirations to also start residency programs. And that was when I had the opportunity to meet Professor Sanait Saha, whom you also well know, and she was a faculty at the University of Michigan at the time, and in the division of REI. And she has been coming to Ethiopia to work with different institutions, mainly she was working with Addis Ababa University, but after that connection, because we also had the desire to also establish residency programs, and as a nation, we also had a problem of OBGYN. I mean, maternal health was a big challenge. So that led to jointly establishing the residency program. So through that connection, the partnership with the University of Michigan, which grew, then that also led to my role at the University of Michigan. But that I as a clinician, I always thought I would remain a clinician because it is truly something I loved doing. But I've always seen, especially in countries like ours, where we have so many challenges, unless we really work also on the health system improvements and make it better for those who are working on the clinical work, things won't improve. So that was why I was progressively drawn to more into the public health, the policy, the leadership role, and later landed in the ministry as a state minister and now the Minister of Health.
What a great journey. Thanks for sharing that. One of the lessons I heard there for the learners on this discussion is that most of us have got to our places not because we sought it as a destination, but we kept exposing ourselves to new opportunities. And what I heard from your discussion is bumping into people who open new doors for us. So I think we could both always encourage our learners, keep exposing yourself to being disrupted. You're never going to plan out your course in full, but take a step into the unknown and make things happen, like Leah has, who has just had a wonderful journey, wonderful preparation. And I want to start to steer the conversation a bit, Leah, into educational models. But before I do, I wonder if I could just pick up on a tension that you referred to. You started out like me with a passion to take care of people and then individuals. And then as you were doing so, you thought you saw, boy, the system isn't very good. And you got restless about taking care of the system, fixing the system and doing population health, which, thank goodness we've got our colleagues in public health and in other places that think much better about that than those of us who are physicians. But that tension where you had to leave taking care of the individual to suddenly think about taking care of populations and thinking about systems. How have you navigated that? How have you dealt with that, kind of starting off with one passion, and then I imagine you're so busy right now, you don't have that luxury of taking care of an individual because you're focusing on 115 million people. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It has, especially in the beginning, it was challenging for me because, as you know, as a clinician, when you take care of patients, you see the results quickly, and especially in OBGYN, I think we see it much quicker than you do in internal medicine. But so that was really what makes it also more gratifying. But when you are working in leadership roles, health system improvement, the change takes time to see. So really that was one of the missing the role of clinical work by itself is one thing, but also that challenge of this requires time, requires patience but eventually you see the change, and eventually those changes have bigger impact for many people. So I think that's what eventually seeing those results making an impact, it really became more gratifying. And now I can think of what can I do more on that regard. So it has definitely, it was challenging, and still I sometimes still miss it, but I also see my role can bring bigger impact.
Well, I know I speak for many when I say thank you for making that transition. I know you're making a big difference in your current role. As we start to think about education, you have such a unique perch. You're looking over a system. You're thinking about society as, and the public good. Sometimes those of us in education can be accused of just living in the ivory tower. We're just doing our ivory tower polishing, where we're writing our papers, doing our education, but often we could be criticized for not connecting education to the good of society. So you spent so much time in education. Now you're dealing with the good of society. I wonder if you could say a bit about education models that you see that you've seen work, that you've been particularly attracted to. And obviously you're a citizen of two worlds. We were lucky to have you with us here in Ann Arbor for a number of years, deeply embedded in our system. You came from Ethiopia, you went back to Ethiopia. So you know two worlds. Could you talk about education systems that, and maybe some reflections on that connectivity between Michigan and Ethiopia, and how we can better design education for the good of society.
Thank you, Joe. Overall, I think when we see the education system and the bigger system, the society, the impact of the academic systems cannot be really separately taken from the overall growth or development in any society. I may be focused more on the health sector because I'm in the health sector in terms of also the education. My examples may be more inclined to that, but definitely the education, what we produce in the education system is what eventually influences how we develop as a society, as countries, as nations. And in terms of models, especially in terms of, since you mentioned especially how the models of partnership work, and what I have seen, there has been different experiences of different types of partnerships that I have had the chance to experience in terms of, in my different roles throughout, but especially in academic partnerships, we've seen some are specifically driven by specific projects that may be time bounded, so and also specific tailor-made, and some are really evolve continuously and are built by mutual partnerships of both institutions in countries, and mostly since we are talking about also North and South partnerships and collaborations, so I had those different opportunities, and even there are also have been instances like where universities in the US and other countries have been engaged in establishing vertical programs in countries when we had the need for that, like when HIV programs were introduced in many African countries. They were mostly led or supported by universities in the North, which had its own really huge advantage, but also had its own challenge in the way the vertical programs were designed in terms of sustainability. But I definitely would like to highlight how our partnership with the University of Michigan, especially which started at St. Paul for us, had evolved, and really the strong results and successes of that partnership. And of course, we will all have challenges, but I would say from the different partnership, it has been one of really the strong partnership models. It initially began with really solving the problem at the priority problem in the host country. So usually, I think many years back, we have seen a lot of partnerships globally where it's usually focused on getting experience for students, and mainly that is a focus, although all partnerships still have that, need to have that core pillar, but this was one of that aspects of the partnership. It mainly focused on what is the key challenge that we have in the system and how can that partnership help in solving that problem. So developing training programs through the partnership was the big priority we agreed upon, and we co-designed the curriculum that's needed for opening those residency training programs. And then also it was not just run by, because these were new programs, we didn't have enough faculty, but that didn't even mean that it was run by University of Michigan faculty. It was actually run by the local faculty, but was supported by, strongly supported by University of Michigan faculty who are coming with students, and also our faculty were going to get that experience sharing as well to Michigan. And this also really was not just focused on having just a residency program, but it made sure the quality of training was competency-based. It also made sure it included service quality improvements as part of the core aspect of the partnership. So it just didn't focus only on the academic piece, but also the service that is being provided to the community as well. And it embedded also research in the partnership. It was really a core component which helped in two main ways. One is in developing research capacity of the local faculty, but also in generating evidence that can help in improving services again, getting more local evidences for improvement. So the sustainable model of those programs, which eventually were fully run by the faculty locally, is really a true key aspect of the model that I have seen work very well in terms of especially the sustainable building capabilities sustainably. So it was a holistic, I can say it was a holistic approach, but also anchored on sustainability.
Well, thank you. And it's been really a privilege for us to share that journey with you and your colleagues in Ethiopia. And again, we're talking about education, so I'm glad you talked about training. And obviously this fireside chat is a little bit more connected to health, but we're very mindful that health is only one component or dimension of Africa Week, this discussion. But I reflect on some of our past models of training and education and global health. I think many of us in the United States are mindful about 25% of the doctors in the United States come from outside of the United States. And I'm very aware that's a space I spent a lot of time in. It became very clear to me that we often attract people to come here because of our education systems. But unfortunately, we then train people not to fit in back home. I think most people, when they go someplace, they often think they're going there for a little bit, and then they're going to go back home. But because of our education system here, people, have to train for 3, 4, 5 years. By that time, they've learned skills that are appropriate to our system. It's a context that they've been trained for, but it doesn't necessarily translate for them back home. So unfortunately, those of us in the United States have been very guilty of creating brain drain, attracting people here, training them not to fit in back home, and here they stay. What we so enjoyed about partnering with Ethiopia was the chance to train people in Ethiopia within that context, and for us to learn and be part of that and be transformed by that process. But I'm so, again, inspired by your journey. You were trained there, then spent time in the United States. Then you went back. Were there things about your time at the University of Michigan or things about your time in Ann Arbor that you think particularly prepared you to be health minister? Were there things that advantaged you and really set you up to succeed in your current role? Looking back, are there things that you learned while you were here at University of Michigan that are helping you out now?
Yes, definitely. I mean, every step of my journey has had its own contributions in the 3 years at the University of Michigan, which really gave me the opportunity to connect with different schools within the university and different partners of the university. So, and also look into the system of how the education system has been working at the university, and the collaborations we've had was not limited to where the Center for International Reproductive Health Training was seated on. It was not limited. I had the opportunity to work with different parts of the medical school, the School of Public Health, and other members of the university, as the university as a whole, and even beyond that, also with different partnerships through the university. And the experience and the learnings of especially the models of training and also the different leadership models and programs that were in place were quite a learning for me. That really also helped us. Also, while I was there, the work that we were doing was expanding in the work in Ethiopia, but also we had the work started in Rwanda as well. So all those opportunities had their own impact on has helped me definitely in the progress, and it was truly a learning opportunity for me, and an opportunity to also form really amazing relationships. And I've learned from many members of the faculty at the University of Michigan, and including you, Joe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leah. I can assure you I've gotten much more from our relationship and from what I've learned in my times in Ethiopia than I've been able to contribute. So thank you. For our audience, I will try and do my best to weave in any questions that people have. If people would like to use the question box, and I will try and add those in as they come up. Leah, we're talking, as we talk about education, maybe reflecting on the Michigan-Ethiopia interface, an area that has come up for us in global health is this whole concept of decolonizing global health. I have to say we're probably a little bit behind other disciplines. I think the field of education and, of course, anthropology and other areas have been talking about this for decades. I think you touched on this a little bit in some of your earlier comments. We've really been imposing agendas often on the African continent. You touched on HIV and AIDS, and suddenly the United States came up with $30 billion through their PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, into Africa. But it was driven by a very specific agenda. And unfortunately, if we look back on a lot of the research funding that comes onto the continent, it can also often be driven by an agenda in the global north. That's where the money comes from. So we're way behind in the global health movement in trying to think about how do we decolonize our approach and our thinking. Can you offer us any advice on trying to decolonize global health? Obviously the infusion of some money and some talent has been good, but suddenly dominating the agenda and driving a specific worldview is colonization again. And so I know the global health community nationally, but many of us are trying to wrestle with this. Any advice, any observations?
Yes, definitely the growth in the interest in global health and partnerships, especially academic partnerships, so in the past few decades has been really truly helpful in many ways for all countries in terms of academic development, and grows in the area of different disciplines. And the way it was, as you said, the way the colonization kind of approach has progressively definitely improved to make it more mutual programs. But as you said, there are still rooms for improvement in our approach these days as well. Most programs, I think, as I mentioned earlier, are focusing on the local problems and how to address a local context, but also the solutions have to be also mutually driven, mutually designed, because it's not just addressing the local problem, but how we address the problem should also not be just, as you said, imposed. And even in research, as you said, most research areas, interest areas would come, but it should be designed together in terms of starting from the question we want to answer in the research, and then what we want to solve through the research, of course, needs that approach. And there are, of course, many motivation factors for all players in global health. Many motivation, most of them are really very good, well meant, but we always have to focus on the impact it brings to improve the gaps that we have, especially the equity gaps that we have, and how can ultimately this partnership bring us closer and bring those countries to really a sustainable, the road to sustainable development. It should ultimately bring that result, be it through academia, be it through health programs and others. I think that is one key, it should be one key motivating factor, mutual one. It should have the benefit, should be for both sides, but it should have a local context, local problem solving, and also with a passion, really, with a commitment to bring some change in terms of the progress of in those defined disciplines. We are talking about all disciplines, not just health, but that's why I'm usually pulled to that. But definitely in all aspects of development, be it education, health, and other sectors. So I think that's the main core principles. I think if those motivating factors are there, and ultimately we should think of ownership to be by the local institutions. Otherwise, the sustainability usually goes back, and that's not what we want. If we invest that much of our time and resources, then it should show meaningful progress and sustainable one. So ownership also has to be also, I think, given to the local institutions.
Yeah, I think that was very well said. I so like our discussion that it's mainly focused on health, not healthcare, health. We know that the social determinants of health cross so many different disciplines. I think all of the disciplines at the University of Michigan and at Addis Ababa University and the great schools of higher education in Ethiopia. So there's so many determinants of health. And that's really what we're talking about. You've talked about sustainability. I think it's such a crucial word. What's the win-win for both sides? A lot of times higher education in the United States have looked at places in the global South as a place for their learners. We're gonna ship off our students. That's the win for us. We provide them with a learning opportunity. I think what we've been trying to do, at least in our relationships with Ethiopia, and this exists with many of our schools, is stay very mindful of the win-win. I think sustainability requires a win-win. At least from my perch, I see a lot of do-gooders running into a place, but if they don't create the sustainability model on our side, it's not going to continue. There's a good heart there, but it's not going to continue. Yet, if it's just one-sided, we're getting a benefit from sending off our students, or our researchers can get access to data. That's very colonial, and that's not win-win. So I do believe there's an art and science to collaboration and how we design and think about that. I wonder if we could spend the last 5 minutes trying to dream about the future. here I'm going to try and weave in some of the questions that we've seen, but I wonder if we could dream about what the University of Michigan, Ethiopia collaboration looks like in 2040. What's that New York Times article read like? What have we accomplished? What have we done together? What's the win-win? What are we building towards? Can you think of some elements that you're hoping are just vibrant and alive in the University of Michigan Ethiopia collaboration in 2040? And I'll do the same because we're both going to be mindful of our win side. But can we just dream and see what that looks like? Would you like to start, or is it easier for me to start?
You can start, Joe.
All right. Yes, I can be fuller of hot air, as you know, through our long years of friendship, but I would love a platform that's so porous that people are going back and forth between Ethiopia and the University of Michigan, physically, but also making use of these things we're learning through Zoom, where we can have a much deeper appreciation of the context, the culture, and the people. I would love that kind of exposure for our students so that they can have their assumptions disrupted. You know, we always have a vision of something far away. We develop our assumptions, but whenever we get there, our assumptions are disrupted. So that people could have their assumptions totally disrupted and have a deep understanding of what is the situation in Ethiopia. What are the richness in the appreciation of the culture, but what's the problems? And what are the problem-solving opportunities? And to have that same way for people from Ethiopia to embed themselves in our culture without having to be totally transformed. They can kind of go back and forth like you have and bring some of the good parts back over the net and maybe keep going back and forth. And that is such an enabled process that people feel transformed, and the University of Michigan continues to be a better place because of what they've learned from the partnership in Ethiopia, and that maybe Ethiopia is better, and people are what they've learned from the partnership with Michigan, and that maybe we're the partner of choice when people are saying, I want to do research, I want to study, I want to make things better, and that we just have this easy platform that's that is just very enabled, that builds on UMAPs and some of the other programs that we have underway, but it's transforming our institution. And if we could reach that state with Ethiopia, I think we would be so privileged. But that's my dream. That's what I'd like to see the New York Times article writing about. But thoughts or reactions?
Well, that's beautiful, Joe. You have finished what I would like also to see. It's beautiful. And before I just say that, what I would like to see, just to reflect a little bit on what you said earlier on how, well, to get to 2040, we need to have really a sustainable partnership model. And I think one of the key elements we always have in partnerships is the soft element, the people element, which strong relationships are always there. Strong, those who are committed to push those partnerships are there to help it flourish. But also that needs to be supported through a system in both ends to make it sustainable. I think that's one thing we may do better to reach to where we want to go. I remember when I was in Michigan, we always have been trying to to track who is doing what in the different disciplines in Ethiopia, because even within the University of Michigan, there were many faculty doing work in Ethiopia but didn't know that each other. But there was no strong. There was an attempt through the provost office now that Valerie leads to have the AMC initiative, but that kind of really having a system in place to coordinate all those activities so that it doesn't depend on people's motivation, because there is always a driving force behind to ensure that continues. But that needs to be there also here in Ethiopia, in the different institutions, at ministry level, at different levels, so that this continues, because we need to really continue to build on what we have started, which is really, I feel like this is one of the model partnerships that has been built for Ethiopia, and it needs to continue. And we have seen a lot of training programs being established, and even big healthcare programs like kidney transplant that were established through this partnership in Ethiopia. So I do hope in 2040, those partnerships will continue to flourish, and even having a strong program already in place that is led by the local institution doesn't mean that it doesn't need the partnership anymore. It still continues to improve it. The research aspect is there. Still, we are continuously improving, let alone in Ethiopia, you are continuously improving at the University of the Kerry Hub at Michigan. So that continues, and we want to see several, because we have a vision now to really expand a lot of things in Ethiopia. So with the partnership, I want to see this amount of training programs opened and really full-fledged capacity created, and this kind of evidence is generated that have helped bring solutions to the local community, but also have brought a lot of impact also in Michigan. So hopefully that's the future we will see, and I'm sure we will be able to see that with the strong commitment and passion, and with the different institutions and institutes within the University of Michigan as well.
Well, thank you. And I know we're at time. Minister Tedeschi, it's been so good to have this conversation. Thank you for your friendship. And I know Ethiopia and the University of Michigan are going to continue to grow together and be better off for it. I'm going to turn this back over to our moderators for the wrap up. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kolarz and Minister Tedeschi, for this engaging discussion. I really like how much of it has focused on exchanges between Ethiopia and the US, and that sets us up perfectly for the next part of Africa Week. So our next panel, which begins at 9:30 Eastern Time, so in 7 minutes, is focused on exchange programs between Africa and the United States and the role that it plays in this ecosystem that has been the theme of all of Africa Week. So thank you, Joe and Leah. Thank you for everybody who joined us for this conversation. Please stay online. We will use this exact same Zoom webinar link also for the panel discussion starting in 6 or 7 minutes. Thank you. good afternoon to everybody joining us from Africa, or good morning if you are joining us from North America. I know that we also have people who registered for this event from Asia, so good evening if you are joining us from that part of the world. My name is Andries Coetzee. I am a professor of linguistics here at University of Michigan, also the director of the African Studies Center here. There's a sense in which this panel on US-Africa exchanges is really at the core of Africa Week, right? This whole conference has focused on relationships between Africa and the United States or North America, and the theme that has run through all of these discussions has been that we live in an ever more connected world, right? What happens in the African economy impacts the world economy. We heard about that in the discussion on Monday morning between Provost Susan Collins and Vera Songwe, the executive director of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. On Tuesday morning, in the discussion between Dean Alec Gallimore of our College for Engineering and President Patrick Awuah, the founder and president of Aseshi University in Ghana, we heard how President Awuah's thinking as he was setting up Aseshi University was influenced by his experiences in the US educational system, but we also heard how Dean Gallimore was thinking about how we at the University of Michigan might want to replicate some of the initiatives that President Awuah has instituted at Aseshi University. So everything at Africa Week has focused in some way on the relationship between African and US institutions. And that really places this panel that specifically focuses on academic exchange programs between the continent and the US at the center of Africa Week. Collaborations across the Atlantic depend on institutional relationships, and institutional relationships are built on personal relationships, and personal relationships come about only through bringing people together. In this panel this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world, we'll focus on different models for how this can happen between academic institutions on the continent and in North America. We'll hear from individuals with extensive experience in this domain, both from the side of African institutions of higher education, the side of North American institutions, and also from organizations involved in funding and supporting these types of initiatives. We'll think together about what works, what doesn't work, and we will imagine what a future might look like in which these kinds of exchange programs are truly living up to their full potential of being mutually beneficial, sustainable, and equitable. The plan for our discussion is as follows. We really want this to be a discussion, so you will always see all of us together on the screen. I will start with briefly introducing each of our panelists, but I'll be very brief because after that I will ask them each to self-introduce and say something about where they are coming from to this conversation about, exchange programs between Africa and the US. And then we will go, after those brief opening statements, into a discussion amongst the panelists. I will pose some questions, but in the spirit of this being a discussion, I also want to invite our panelists to respond to each other or pose questions to each other. Throughout, the Q&A function will be available. So our audience, you can find that at the bottom of your screen, and you can type questions there that you want our panelists to address. We'll try to get to as many as those as we can in the time that's available to us. But okay, let me then very briefly introduce each of our panelists before then asking them to make short opening statements and do a little bit of self-introduction. And I'll go in alphabetical order by last name. So our first panelist for this discussion is Ashley Collier, who is the lead for North American partnerships at the MasterCard Foundation. The MasterCard Foundation has been a major funder for many in the space of educational exchange programs between Africa and North America. And Ashley will therefore bring to our discussion the perspective of funders engaged in this space. Our next panelist is my colleague from University of Michigan at the African Studies Center, Enrique Floresbos. Enrique is an anthropologist and an Africanist, and her research focusing on Francophone West Africa, specifically Mali. But she's also a member of the leadership team at the African Studies Center and very closely involved there with our University of Michigan African Presidential Scholars Program, or UMAPS program, which is the cornerstone of the University of Michigan's engagement in Africa. And Enrique will therefore bring this perspective to our panel discussion. Our next panelist is Moses Usiru, who's joining us today from Nairobi in Kenya, where one of the many hats that he wears is as the manager of the Regional Scholarship and Innovation Fund, or RSIF. This is a program that is supported by a consortium of African governments. And amongst the things they do is to enable PhD students, faculty from African universities, to spend time abroad during their studies. So Moses will bring the perspective of an African institution that supports these kinds of exchange programs. Our final panelist is another colleague of mine at the University of Michigan, Rockefeller Oteng. Rocky is a professor of emergency medicine here at University of Michigan. And in addition to his clinical and teaching work here at Michigan, he is also running a program that is aimed at providing capacity strengthening and training in emergency medicine in Ghana, and also building out the emergency medicine system, health system in Ghana. So he will bring another perspective about how US institutions can be involved in training and program building on the African continent. So with that as first broad introductions, I will hand over to each of the panelists to make a short opening statement, and we will again do this in alphabetical order. So Ashley Collier from the MasterCard Foundation, over to you.
Thanks so much, Andres, and thank you to all the organizers of this conference. It's an honor to be invited to be part of this panel, an honor to be with colleagues to have this discussion. So as was mentioned, my name is Ashley Collier, and I am the lead of North American Partnerships at the MasterCard Foundation. And just as a point of background for those of you that are not familiar with the MasterCard Foundation, our vision is really to build a world where everyone has the opportunity to learn and prosper. Everything that we do is founded on the belief that everyone, no matter what their starting point in life, should have an equal chance to opportunity and to dignity in the work that they do. 3 years ago, we launched our Young Africa Works strategy, and the strategy really laid out what the next decade of our work will be focused around, which is one singular goal, to enable 30 million young Africans to transition into dignified and fulfilling work, with a specific focus on young women. So there's a lot of key pillars of the work that we do. We work in financial inclusion, we work in skill development training, but one of the real core fundamental pillars is education, and working in access, but also in quality education. One of our flagship programs within our education portfolio is our scholarship program. So the MasterCard Foundation Scholarship Program, since its inception in 2013, we've supported over 35,000 young people to access higher education. So it's one of the largest scholarship programs of its kind in the world, but specifically in Africa, and supporting young Africans. So we primarily, within both the scholarship program and as a foundation, support and partner with African institutions and African-led institutions, but we also understand the role of global partnerships, global education, global opportunities for young people, which is sort of the specific role that I have at the foundation, working with North American partners, European partners, to forge these global partnerships with African higher ed institutions, and also create opportunities for young people to access undergraduate master's degrees, PhD level degrees, but also exchange programs, internships. We have sort of a whole suite of types of programs that we build with our partners. And the idea is that they would be, partnerships that are based on equity, based on equitable power dynamics. There's some fundamental values that we bring to the conversation when we think about how we devise these global partnerships, which I'll go into in the future. I'll end just by saying that we have a really ambitious goal in Young Africa Works: 30 million young people in dignified and fulfilling work, and we know that it will take a broad suite of partners, higher education partners, private partnerships, government partnerships, in order to achieve that goal. And the role that we'll be talking about today is what does global education, global exchange really bring to that opportunity for young people to get into dignified and fulfilling work. So I'll stop there, and really excited to be a part of this panel and this discussion.
Thank you, Ashley. That is an ambitious goal, but one thing we've heard over and over again at Africa Week is we can only do as big as we think, so we should think big. And I think it is a big goal, but achievable. Next, I'm going to hand over to my colleague and partner from the African Studies Center, Henrike Floresbos. Henrike.
Thank you, Andries, and thank you so much already so far, Ashley. I'm also really excited to be here today and engage with you all about the exchange programs that we are all involved in. So as Andries said, I'm fortunate to work at the University of Michigan's African Studies Center, which runs the University of Michigan African Presidential Scholars Program, or UMAPS. So very briefly, how I came to this role is by having been trained as an anthropologist focusing on Francophone West Africa, first at Leiden University in the Netherlands, up to my MA, and then at the University of Michigan for my PhD. One of the things I learned in Leiden from how the African Studies Center there was organized is that you don't study Africa with just a bunch of European scholars. You want to have African scholars to be part of the academic conversation. And I think really this imperative goes well beyond African studies or the disciplines traditionally concerned with producing knowledge about Africa, such as anthropology and history, although it remains relevant to push for it there also. But really it applies to all disciplines. And this to me still seems the basic impetus for any exchange program, that the depth and breadth of scholarship expands when more people with their particular backgrounds and histories and challenges they face have a seat at the table of academia, and ideas and knowledge flow in all directions. So specifically about the UMAPS program, a little bit, that's an exchange program in the sense that it brings early and mid-career scholars employed at African universities to our campus here in Ann Arbor for 5-month-long research residencies. And then these scholars have the time, energy, and resources to work on a specific project really aligned with their own career goals, from making progress on a dissertation or getting articles published or doing specialized lab research, whatever. And it's also an exchange program in the sense of the mutual learning that happens here when the UMAP scholars become part of the U of M campus community, specifically the home departments of their UM-based faculty host, and which then of course also includes the students in these departments. So what's noticeable here, and that maybe not everybody knows, is that we at the African Studies Center and the UMAPS program specifically serve the entirety of the university, and we've placed UMAPS fellows in departments and units across almost all schools and colleges. And maybe finally, what really interests me about this conversation today is how we're coming to these exchanges from different institutional contexts. So the University of Michigan African Presidential Scholarship Program, as the name indicates, is a US university-based program, and it has been largely university funded in its first 13 years. So there's definitely a university-focused interest there. And I think it behooves us to be somewhat humble and aware of the specific constraints that come from being a US university-based program. At the same time, I want to say that UMAPS was not designed solely by the University of Michigan. In fact, it was conceived from the start as a co-created, mutually beneficial partnership between the University of Michigan and its main African partner universities, at the time mostly in Ghana and South Africa. Conversations between UM's presidents and the presidents and vice chancellors of these African institutions focused on the main challenges of higher education on the continent and how best to address these challenges. And that's how the idea of having an exchange program to help strengthen the capacity of research and teaching staff at African universities was first conceived and made into the reality of UMAPS. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Enrique. I like how you ended on the theme of humility, and I know from have conversations with Ashley that humility is also one of the core values for the MasterCard Foundation in thinking about these exchanges. So I think that's an important theme to keep in mind as we continue our conversation. So next, I want to move over to Moses Isiro in Nairobi, bringing for us the perspective from the RSIF program. Moses.
Thank you, Andreas, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. As introduced, Moses Isiro is my name. I work at ISIPE, which is the International Center of Insect Physiology and Ecology, based in Nairobi, Kenya, but we do have three other offices in Ethiopia, Uganda, and also now one about to start in Benin. So ISIPE was selected in 2018 to host the Regional Scholarship and Innovation Fund, and which is RSIF in short. So RSIF is a relatively new program created by 10 African governments under the umbrella of a partnership of these governments called PASET, the Partnership for Skills in Applied Sciences, Engineering and Technology. And the focus of RSIF is to strengthen doctoral training, research and innovation in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's south of the Sahara, not including South Africa. The program was created and is owned by those 10 African governments, and each have contributed a minimum of $2 million US dollars, with the aim, of course, to strengthen the institutional capacity for quality and sustainable doctoral training, research and innovation in the region. So we aim to double the number of African PhDs in the next 2 decades. So it's a very ambitious goal that RSIF has set up for itself. And since we began just over 2 years ago, we've recruited 82 PhD students who have been awarded scholarships. And this year we should recruit a further 120 or so PhD students. And we hope that this number will climb to at least 300 by next year. And the focus of these awards is on existing faculty who don't have PhD, as well as women, as a means to strengthen the institutional capacity of these universities, and particularly to focus on building new departments in the orphaned or the weaker areas within the African universities. So our model is to really focus on institutional capacity building within 10 African universities that we've selected within specific fields. At present, it's agriculture and food security, climate change, mines, minerals and material science, energy, and ICT, which includes big data, artificial intelligence, etc. So the program has a really rigorous and competitive selection, and we partner with international universities and institutions like University of Michigan. Our students must spend a minimum of 6 months, but up to 24 months with doing attachments at advanced institutions in the US and other parts of the global north. And we expect them to come back with cutting edge research knowledge, strong international networks within and outside Africa, so that this will help boost their academic careers as they start their nascent careers at their home institutions. Personally, I'm a plant pathologist. Previously worked at RU Forum, which is a network of over 100 African universities. And during that time, our focus also was on postgraduate training. And we benefited a lot from a number of training opportunities from the US as well as other parts of the world, of course, including the Higher Education Partnership for Culture Development, the recent BOLOG Higher Education Program for Culture Research and Development, and many others. And I think despite the risk of brain drain and many other challenges that are linked to these collaborations, we see great value in sending students to the University of Michigan and other advanced institutions in the global north. And we also have learned many lessons in the past, which we have tweaked to ensure we can get value from it. So I really look forward to this discussion, and thank you for also having me on this panel. Back over to you, Andreas.
Thank you, Moses. All right, so we've heard a theme of humility in the first two statements, and then Moses also mentioned the very ambitious goal of doubling PhD capacity. Ashley was also talking about having ambitious goals. So it's another theme, you know, we have to think big and aim big, but be ambitious. Okay, so over to the last of our panelists, Rocky Oteng, who I've said is, you know, a faculty member from Michigan working in emergency medicine capacity strengthening in Ghana. Rocky.
All right, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel this morning, and it's great to see these folks again. So for me, I am an emergency physician trained here at the University of Michigan. I currently provide clinical care to my patients in Flint, Michigan at the Hurley Medical Center. And in the process of my work here at Michigan, I have helped to introduce the specialty of emergency medicine into Ghana. We started this work initially back in 2008, 2009, by forming what we called the Ghana Emergency Medicine Collaborative, which is basically an organization, a group formed of the University of Michigan and our Ghanaian partners. So the institutions in Ghana that would be involved in developing a brand new specialty, including the ACGME training equivalent, the Ghana College of Physicians and Surgeons, the Ghana Ministry of Health, the Ghana National Ambulance Service, as well as the teaching hospitals, came together with a group from the University of Michigan to form this Ghana Emergency Medicine Collaborative. In this way, we covered sort of all the people that would be involved and need to be involved in creating a sustainable training platform that would eventually build out human capacity for creating high quality in-country human capacity training for emergency medical care, with the end point of improving delivery of emergency medical care with in-country trained physicians, nurses, EMTs. We built and started all of this work on the idea that the amount and the value and the level of human capacity and intellectual capacity in Ghana is the same as it is here in Ann Arbor. As we started out the work, we made sure that we built it out in such a way that we would be able to provide an opportunity for our initially trainees to flourish and to gain real understanding of emergency medical systems in such a way that they could not only understand it, but then grow to own it and then grow to expand it, not only throughout Ghana, but hopefully throughout their neighboring countries over time. As time has progressed, we've been able to help to create infrastructure and capacity around clinical research, where we help our program participants learn to try to understand why they're seeing their patients, where they're coming from, what are they coming to do, how are they being treated when they do present for emergency medical care. So we've started to build out some infrastructure around, again, capacity and training for clinical research and understanding that, and then turning that clinical research into policies that would benefit the population in Ghana. We spent time specifically creating opportunities for career development and leadership roles within the government space, such that when our folks are trained, they don't sort of find a ceiling that's artificial. We made it one of our key points to make sure that we were developing out a career that someone would want to stay in Ghana to continue to pursue after they've been provided the opportunity to train in emergency medicine. At this point, we've been successful in the sense that our graduates are playing leading roles in developing emergency medicine, both in country, as well as being asked to be experts in developing emergency medical services in other neighboring countries. During this pandemic, they've come to the forefront and have been instrumental in creating policies as well as in creating physical setups that have allowed the Ghanaian population to access high quality emergency medical care during this significant time of need. So that's a little bit about what we've done so far.
Thank you, Rocky. And for the audience who might not recognize the image behind Rocky, that is the hospital in Kumasi, Ghana, where Rocky does most of his work in Ghana. CATH, I don't remember what CATH stands for, K-A-T-H.
It's Comfort Noche Teaching Hospital.
There you go.
Yeah.
And then a reminder to the audience, you can use the Q&A functionality on Zoom if you want to pose questions that you would like us to address. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So thank you to all of our panelists for sketching out for us the historical and also current context in which these kinds of exchange programs happen. There's so many directions that we can go, but before we delve deeper into some of these specific themes, I want to start by asking our panelists to reflect a little bit on the question of why these kinds of exchange programs. From the perspective of each of you who's coming at it from a different direction. I want to start by posing this question to Moses Usiru and Enrique Floresbos. Both of you are involved in programs that bring African scholars to American universities, to American or European, North American or European universities. Can I ask both of you to reflect on the reasons why your institutions are engaged in programs like this? Why would a US institution such as University of Michigan dedicate so many resources to bringing African scholars to our campus, right? Who benefits from that? What is the goal with that? And to Moses, why would African governments, who we've heard from you is supporting the RSIF program, why would they dedicate so many resources to enabling African students to study in the US or Europe, rather than dedicate those resources to developing institutions locally on the continent? So Moses, let me throw that over to you first. I'd like to hear your reflections on this, and then we'll ask Enrique to bring the perspective from a North American institution.
Sure. Thank you, Andreas. I think one could approach this question in a number of ways, but I'll try also to give a bit of background to the response here, to recognize that Africa has grown quite a bit, and likewise the higher education sector on the continent has also grown significantly. There's what we often talk about, massification of the higher education sector with so many new entrants, and the demand for education has increased significantly. But there remains a challenge in terms of capacity. And this is now again where the issue of why we want these partnerships. There's a need to raise significantly the quality of education on the continent. First of all, as you said, only a few people are able to participate in the higher education sector. And then related to that then is that you also then have challenges of having enough high quality institutions that will be able to do the high level And here I'm talking about the postgraduate training, master's and PhD level training. So what many governments have done, or many countries have approached this, is to have a kind of centers of leadership or centers of excellence type approach, where you try to define a specific focus area, topical area, thematic area, and build capacity in that area, recognizing that you don't have the resources to be able to do everything at the same time. And again, the underpinning of this is that we recognize, and many governments recognize, that science is the real development driver. I mean, there's many things are happening in terms of politics, etc. But the only real gains that we make globally, and in Africa, of course, is through science. And so for this to happen, you need to build science capacity. So in the past, we've seen a lot of focus in the areas of agriculture and health, of course, and you know that there are many centers of excellence in those areas, food security and health. But some of the other areas that are interesting for Africa's development have not been covered equally. So places like, for example, mining, energy, ICT, and now the advent of artificial intelligence. So governments have recognized that we must build this capacity quickly in order to benefit from what's happening globally in this very globalized knowledge economy that we have these days. And so in order to build that capacity, you have to start from somewhere. We recognize that we don't have the capacity. So how can we benefit from what exists? So we're going out and reaching out to those places where we have that capacity. One of them, in this case, we're talking about University of Michigan, but many other institutions across the global north, and some institutions also in the global south, to see how we can try to use that to expedite or to kind of accelerate the rate of capacity building. So we're looking at how to get mentorship, how to build international partnerships, how to benefit from innovations that exist and bring this back to Africa, but at the same time, not to run into the challenges of brain drain and so on. Let me pause there, Andreas, and I'll come back.
Thank you, Moses. So that's an interesting perspective in terms of how, although you send individuals to institutions in the north, it is focused on building capacity, strengthening capacity at the institutions on the continent. So the benefit, as you see, it also reflects back to the continent. But let me then throw this question to Henrike. From the perspective of a North American institution, a large public institution such as the University of Michigan, why would we engage in these kinds of programs? I mean, for whom do we do it? Who benefits from our engagement? Why would we dedicate our resources to programs like this? I'd like to get your perspective on that, Henrike.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wanted to also thank you, Moses, for what you just said in your contribution, because that actually really sketches out the context of how UMAPS got started also, with the university vice chancellors pointing out the same issues of capacity strengthening for tertiary training, and also the need for faculty to get a reprieve from very high teaching loads brought on by massification. So I think those are really important points also from our perspective. But yeah, so why would a US institution such as U of M dedicate resources to bringing African scholars to campus? I was actually very happy to hear our president, Mark Slissel, address this in his opening remarks to the conference. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said that research-intensive universities have a big potential to make real change in the world, especially in rapidly changing fields and with regards to important challenges. And that in order to realize this potential, we need everyone at the table. So one part definitely is that we want to do these kinds of things in order to make the best research possible. And equally, if not more important, is that UM's work in Africa aligns with the public ethos of U of M as a public institution, whose mission is in fact to serve the people of Michigan and the world. So that's an argument for focusing on Africa as a really key region of the world in terms of its demographics and future prospects. And so in terms of our teaching, for students to be truly ready for whatever their future careers may be, they need a global cultural awareness and that by definition includes Africa. And finally, I would say kind of the idea of universities as providing a public good, which is entailed in being a public institution. That's also really the challenge we face, considering what we know about the systemic injustices in our own society and highly unequal global structures. So it's definitely worth thinking about how exchange programs such as ours and others operate within these contexts and how they can strategically address them in order to create better and more just systems. I think I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you for those comments, Henrika. I like the themes that you've touched on and how they complement what Moses have pointed out, right? So how kind of the same activity, sending African academics to institutions in the North, contribute to strengthening capacity at their home institutions in Africa, but they also strengthen capacity at places like Michigan, right? Where our students now, for instance, are exposed to African thinkers, right? And not many of our students have the opportunity to travel to Africa. So it creates that opportunity for kind of democratization of the international experience for our students too. But let me pivot over and ask a question, a similar question of Ashley Collier from the MasterCard Foundation. Unlike PASET RSIF, where Moses is engaged with, and the UMAPS program that Henrika is involved with, which are both kind of university-driven initiatives. MasterCard's not an educational institution, it's a foundation. So why would a foundation be involved in this sphere? I know that for you, as you've said in your opening remarks, the foundation focuses a lot on economic development and specifically youth employment as a tool towards economic development. So, and that's reflected in the Young Africa Works strategy. So how do academic exchange programs fit into achieving that broader goal of the foundation? Or what's the role of higher education institutions in achieving the goals of a foundation like MasterCard?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and thank you so much for asking it. So I think that my other panelists really queued up a lot of the similar thinking that we've had of what is the role of global experiences. And as you mentioned, we are a foundation. So our scholarship program, for instance, it's run through 28 different higher ed institutions, primarily of which are in Africa, but we do have several that are in North America, several that are in Europe. And we really, our thinking on this has evolved over time as we've learned from the partners that we've partnered with that are running this program, from the alumni of the program, from, new thinking around, how do you create equitable partnerships that are based on reciprocity, similar to what has been shared before, that there is mutual benefit, whether that be at the institutional level or at the individual student and scholar level. And a lot of the original thinking was, a lot of the filters that we think about when making decisions is, skill development for the future of work. How do we ensure that young people across Africa have the skills, the mindsets, the opportunities that they need in order to transition into dignified and fulfilling work, whether that be formal work, informal work, entrepreneurship. What are the skills that are necessary? And there is absolutely a role for global experiences when we think about, the world is globalizing rapidly, even, with COVID, making us stay put for the time being. Our world is still rapidly globalizing, and there's a global marketplace. There is a need for enhanced global perspectives and global networks to really be able to maximize and achieve within individual careers. So a lot of that went into our thinking around developing programs with North American institutions at the undergraduate level, at the master's level. A lot of learning went into that. We design completely different types of partnerships now, addressing some of the lessons that we've learned in, whether it be addressing brain drain, what is the incentives for young people who do go to higher ed institutions, outside of their home country to return back to their home country? How do you design better that transition support, those pathways back? I'll just mention one really interesting partnership that we have between a North American institution and an African institution, between Arizona State University and CanUST in Ghana, where students actually spend 3 years of their undergrad at CanUST. They come for their 4th year at Arizona State University, but they actually get their undergraduate degree from CanUST, and then they are if they have the grades, automatically registered for an accelerated master's program at ASU. So they graduate with a master's degree at ASU, which, the majority of their time was still spent in Ghana, in their home country, where they were able to build networks, build career networks, build faculty relationships, but still were able to get a global experience as well, and also the networks that they got when they went to ASU. And we see that transition back significantly higher through that program than some of our more traditional programs, where students would do a 4-year undergrad, the full 4 years, and then do their master's, and then also go on and do their PhD studies in US and Canada. And that ability to go back seems further and further away. So, I know we're going to get into learnings and how to, design and create programs further, but I just wanted to mention that we do heavily invest in African institutions in developing opportunities for young people to go to, really state-of-the-art, incredible higher ed institutions in Africa, but also see that continued role for global experiences, and how can we get more creative and more in designing programs that are really mutually beneficial. And I'll stop there.
I'm really happy that you could join us for this conversation, Ashley, because you sitting at the foundation has a view over many different of these exchange programs run through the foundation, whereas each of us have kind of detailed experience with only 1 or 2, and that broader view brings in interesting ideas. Something that you mentioned that actually then aligns quite nicely with the program that Moses runs and the UMEPS program at Michigan is both of those programs are also focused on students. Not everybody in the UMEPS program is a student still, but many are students at African institutions who get their degrees there, but spend some time abroad, right? So that's a specific model that is replicated through several of the programs here. But before we get into talking amongst ourselves, I just want to give an opportunity for Rockefeller Oteng also to reflect on this general question a little bit. So Rocky, you've been involved for many years in this program that develops emergency medicine training, but also health systems in Ghana. And I believe, if I understand the program correctly, students and faculty from Michigan go over to Ghana to do teaching and learning there. But I also think that Ghanaian colleagues have come and spent some time at Michigan. So it's kind of a flow in both directions. But what I'm wondering is, why this program? Why this model? Who is this for? Is it for the Ghanaian people? Is it for the Michigan students, faculty primarily? When we met earlier, Rocky kind of put a challenge to all of us, saying, a question we should all answer is, why am I doing this? Why this program? What is my program doing that otherwise wouldn't happen? So, Rocky, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, it's always important, I think, when you try to get into a space. I am not the first person to try to improve emergency medicine in developing context. When I was a resident at Michigan, there were a lot of other programs running. Right now, if you Google emergency medicine globally, you'll find 15, 20 other institutions here in the United States who have programs active in multiple different countries. When we set out, I specifically said to myself that I wasn't going to do the things that I had seen done that I found to be completely disrespectful, to be honest with you. I think in a lot of programs, they start off with a real mindset that like sort of permeates the work, and that mindset is, it's going to be good enough. Right? It should be good enough for Ghana. It should be good enough for Kenya. This is good enough for Tanzania. This is good enough for Ethiopia. I refuse to allow that into our program. Our program is an emergency medicine program. Our nurses are going to be able to walk into the University of Michigan from Cath and Kumasi, from our hospitals in Accra, from our hospitals in Tamale, where they've trained their whole time, walk into the University of Michigan and understand exactly what's happening and be able to pick up just like that. The differences should only be in the system that we're running here versus the system that they're running there, right? I've always thought that there's really no way for me to introduce emergency medicine as a specialty. The best that I could do is to train emergency physicians who not only understand the clinical work itself, but understand the enterprise and the idea around emergency medicine as a public health venture in such a way that they can own it and create Ghanaian emergency medicine specifically for their population. I didn't live in Ghana long. I don't understand the intricacies that happen in that culture. I do not understand a lot of things. But the people that understand it, live there, have been raised there, are part of that system. And all that we were bringing, our mindset was we were bringing the training structure around what emergency medicine can be, allowing their intellectual capacity to take over, their brilliance to take over and take what we have provided them and turn it into something that we could never have imagined. So in doing the work that we do in Why Us, and why our program, it's because that's how we started and that's how we've maintained it. There've been a lot of potential partners who we have chosen not to work with because I felt like the mindset wasn't there. They didn't share that vision. They didn't share that vision that our colleagues there truly will become colleagues in a short amount of time. We made sure that we were not going to have trainees forever, not mentees forever, but that we were creating true partners who going forward would be the ones coming up with new ideas that we haven't thought of, and we would be the ones learning from them. Our exchange programs have sort of two purposes. From the Michigan side, it gives residents an opportunity to practice in an environment where there's less structure. And let me explain that. In the United States, there are certain things that we have to do because of the medical legal culture that we live in, right? In developing settings, that medical legal culture is very different. And so sometimes as a clinician, the thing to be correct, you're unable to really do here in the US because it's not sort of standard of care. Let me give an example. Someone comes in and maybe they're elderly, 100 years old, and they have a significant brain bleed. They've had a trauma and they're bleeding into their brain. Okay. Everybody, even if you're not a physician, knows the outcome, right? This is not going to be something that the person walks away from and lives from. Here in the US, if that person came into my emergency department and was having trouble breathing because of the brain bleed, family member could say, hey, I want you to do everything, put them on a ventilator, do all these invasive procedures, right? And I would have no choice. I would do that happily for them. But in a way, it would hurt me because I would understand that person's final, few days maybe in this physical world would be spent completely as a vegetable, debilitated, going through procedures that in the end aren't going to change the outcome, right? But when our residents, when I practice, when I go to Ghana, in that same situation, we had an opportunity to sort of create a better situation where we would explain to the families what was happening, where we had an opportunity to explore some of the clinical skills that we've learned without, having access to all the technology right now. Right. So it's a great training environment for our people here in Michigan to go there. On the other side of it, one of the things that sometimes goes unspoken is that coming from the African perspective, a training program in Africa is always somewhat felt to be inferior to a training program at Michigan, right? There's this feeling about it. And so when I went and I was like, listen, we're gonna create a training program that's a high quality standard in Ghana. A lot of people were like, well, Rocky, what if you just took me to Michigan, you trained me there? And I was like, that's not the point. The point is I could train you here just as well as I can train you in Michigan. And so to hammer home that point, our residents would come and rotate here at Michigan. And when they rotated here at Michigan, they wouldn't work with me. I wouldn't work with them clinically. They would work with the other attendings here at the University of Michigan. And at the end of the rotation or somewhere through the rotation, it never fails, it would happen, where a random attending who's maybe hadn't worked with them would see them and say to them, hey, you know what? You're doing a great job. It's like you've always been here, right? And that bit I found in our research later on, I found that somebody saying to them or them gaining that experience and knowing that they could function in a well-developed emergency medical system just with the training that they got in Ghana really reinforced the fact that the training that they were getting in Ghana was high quality. You know, it's a sort of a human thing where it's hard when you're in that environment and you don't have, you know, a ton of resources that you see on TV or you've heard about here and there to feel as though the training you're getting is equivalent to what someone is getting here at the University of Michigan. And during those exchanges, interacting with residents here, being part of the culture here, walking into an emergency department, working and understanding what was happening without a huge gap, I think was really huge in sort of solidifying to them that the program that they were a part of in Ghana was high quality and worth their time.
Yeah, thank you, Rocky. You know, Ashley mentioned earlier that, I think it was Ashley, that exchanges aren't really happening now because of COVID. And we're all, you know, meeting on Zoom, which is what made this whole conference possible. But something that Rocky mentioned now, I think is something that all of us believe in, that personal experience of walking into the emergency department at the University of Michigan or at CATH in Kumasi. And that goes beyond the content of the academic training. But that is part of the value of exchange programs. And that's why I'm really looking forward to the end of COVID so that in-person exchanges can happen again. But I want to follow up on something else that Rocky mentioned. He said that, he's been approached by many institutions who would like to partner with him. And, you know, he thinks carefully about who to partner with. I know that's generally true of how we think at the University of Michigan. When we are thinking about whom to partner with, we're looking for institutions who share our values and vision of the world and higher education. But I want to throw this question to Moses and think about this from the perspective of an African institution, organization, such as PASET RSIF. So as North American and European institutions are realizing the central place of Africa, there's this rush from the North to find partners in Africa, to engage in Africa. How does an African consortium such as PASET think about selecting their partners? So what do you look for? Because I'm sure you are inundated with more requests for partnership than you can accommodate. And I know that RSIF takes this seriously because we just recently went through the process of applying to be a partner in RSIF, and they subjected the University of Michigan to a rigorous evaluation. So Moses, how do you think about selecting your partners outside of Africa? What makes a good partner for you?
Thanks, Andreas. This is an interesting question because I mean, I think this will not always be the situation, and I think we've also begun to see this with some parts of the world. For example, when we partner with places like some European countries like Norway and Sweden and so on, that as the landscape in Africa is beginning to change, you find a lot more people beginning to look out for partnerships. And I think then you begin to realize that actually there are beginning to be quite a number of seekers on the African side, which you may not necessarily always find the opposite on the other side. But coming back to the specific question, we have certain things that we're looking for, of course, because the African governments also have made very clear what their intention and ambition of the program is. And to mention some of them, of course, we are looking for academic excellence, and this goes without saying, which is normally not as easy to find as you would assume. And also the contribution of that institution to knowledge globally. So a number of institutions are focused within a specific area, but don't have necessarily a focus globally. So this is one specific criteria that we look for. Secondly, we also like to find an institution that has or already has plans to focus on Africa, and particularly to develop higher education and research and those focus areas within its ambit. So for example, University of Michigan already has this, for a long time you've been working with Ghanaian and South African, and now many other universities are part of your partnerships. So that's what we're looking for. We want to develop a long-term partnership. So we look for someone who is also looking to have a focus on Africa. And to see this also, we want to see a strong record of international partnerships, because it's always easier with someone who has that experience. And this also comes to one of the lessons that we've learned, that we are also looking for, we recognize that partnerships are also based on individuals. So when you have people who have a record of international partnerships, you also have an idea of what they're looking for and what they've learned over the past that you can benefit from. And then the other one I'll mention lastly, there are a number of others, but I'll stop here to mention that we're also looking for an institution that has similar focus areas. So for example, PhD programs that are very much aligned with the thematic areas that we're interested in within our African host universities, so that we can have this collaboration, long-term partnerships developing between the Northern institution or the American institution with our African host universities. So let me stop there for now, Andreas, back over to you.
Thank you. So I am going to try to weave in some of the questions that are populating in the Q&A, and rather than posing one specific question, I'm picking up on themes that I'm seeing coming up in a couple of the questions. And one of our questions specifically comment on the fact that all of the programs that we've been talking about here, or most of them, are focused at graduate students, PhD students, medical specialization, or the UMAPS program even is focused on faculty who've already attained their PhDs. So kind of at the more senior level of student or even post-student academic, and therefore kind of by design engage with a small number of individuals. So what about the very large number of undergraduate students in Africa, but also in the US, right? So do we have to think about exchange programs going down to the level of undergraduate students? And one of our questions even asks, and what about high school students? Kind of that pipeline feeding into the higher education system. Should we, does it behoove us to expose African high school students and US high school students also already to exchanges? And maybe I'll throw this to Ashley, because I know the MasterCard Foundation do also have a large focus on undergraduate lower level students, not just at the graduate level. So, what's your thoughts here?
Yeah, so the majority, so I said before that we had, the majority of the scholarship program, there's 35,000 scholarships that's been committed to date. We just committed another 15,000 last year at the higher ed level, the majority of which are at the undergrad. Understanding that this access to higher education is still a huge challenge, and there's still, it's a very low percentage of young people that are able to transition into higher education. But even within that, number of undergraduate, scholarships that we provide, a much smaller section is actually for a global experience. The majority of our scholarship program are run through African institutions that in some cases have global exchanges, a summer exchange as a part, but we really take the approach of co-designing and co-creating with individual institutions the program itself. So understanding the needs, understanding the opportunities that currently exist within the institution where they see opportunity to expand, to grow. The idea is not only to provide more opportunities for individuals, but also work at the institutional level as well, and to work with others to shore up more opportunities. There's only so much one individual organization, founder, or foundation can do. So the idea is that, that's where system change comes in. We used to actually in the past work at the secondary level through scholarship programs as well, and very quickly pivoted and said, access in secondary isn't necessarily through a scholarship, is not necessarily the right way to make scalable and sustainable change. And instead working more directly through ministries of education, supporting teacher training, supporting digital enhancements at the secondary level, looking at different aspects to improve quality, to improve graduation rates, to improve transition rates once you graduate either into higher education or into the world of work. Those are, so there's a need to be very contextual. Every country is different. Every program needs to be different and adapted to what the needs are, what the opportunities are. And I think that that's, when we think about scale and when we think about the depth of the need, especially at the accessing higher education, there's also the need on the other side too of that transition. Once you've graduated from, you have your undergrad, you have your master's degree, does that necessarily mean that you're going to graduate into a job? And what is that transition support? And some of these global exchanges are where we see some of the keys to success. Not always, not across the board, but I do think that there's a huge role in providing these types of exchanges to enhance skills, to enhance networks and opportunities. But again, the mindset that we have is listening, humility, co-creation. Everything needs to be unique and tailored to the needs of individuals. So, or to institutions and to countries. So that's sort of our approach, but we do, understand that, the accessing and the higher undergraduate level is a key thing that we're trying to address.
Thank you, Ashley. There's so much that one can follow up on that, but Moses, I think you want to quickly add to this.
Yes, please, because I think we've been kind of mentioned also in this question. And the approach of RCIF is also looking at scale. Although at present we have 300 students in the next year or so, but the focus is on building African higher education institutions, and particularly universities. That some of these universities have student numbers of 100,000 and so on, but we need to lead this with knowledge. So we're trying to build that cadre of PhD qualified staff who will go back and support training within these African universities based on context and based on knowledge. So our plan is to train between 20,000 to 40,000 PhD students in the next 20 years. And those students will go back to different institutions across the continent. At present, we've mobilized about 60 million. And the African countries are continuously contributing to the pot, and we're creating an endowment fund. And this endowment also will keep this sustainable going into the future. Let me back to you, Andreas.
Thank you for that, Moses. So we only have about 10 minutes of time remaining. I thought an hour and 15 minutes is long, but it goes by very quickly. So there's one more topic that I really want us to think about, and that's funding all these exchange programs. So I want to pose a question about that, and then ask the panelists who have something to say to contribute to that. And then I also want to allow each of you at the end just a minute or so to make a closing statement, reflections upon our discussion that you might want. But the topic that I would like us to still specifically address is funding, right? It's kind of the proverbial elephant sitting in the corner of the room. All these programs that we talk about cost money, right? We have to be able to fund and support these programs. And as all of us know, working in this space, it's not easy to do so, right? So these programs are programs that invest in people, in individuals, in human capacity building. And often the measurable outcomes from these investments for their impact on society, for instance, is years or decades down the line from when the initial investment happens. So how do we talk successfully to funders about this, right? We need a specific kind of funder who is willing to kind of wait for the deliverables, to have this kind of future vision. So maybe, Ashley, as somebody who works with a foundation that funds these programs, can say something about that. But then I also know that Rocky, for instance, has been very active in trying to gain funding from foundations. So also like to hear from you, Rocky. How do you present your program to funders such that they are willing to fund you now for a deliverable that's years down the road? But first, let's get to Ashley.
Sure. I love this elephant in the room that usually gets thrown to me. And I'll do my best to provide some thinking that might be helpful from our foundation. We certainly, I only represent the MasterCard Foundation. Every major foundation has their own approach to the way that they build out their strategies. And I actually want to comment on something that Rocky said earlier about shared vision. And I think that that's one of the most critical things when you think about even who you reach out to as a funder. Do you have a shared vision of both what you're trying to accomplish, the impact that you're trying to have, but also how you're trying to do it? The how is just as important as the end result. Is it respectful? Is there dignity? Is there humility? Is there true listening and co-creation that's happening? And not everyone is, has similar understandings or visions of how to go about building partnerships and the role of global education. There's hard choices that you have to make as well. We all do. But as a funder, there's also, when we think about sustainability, scale, these are, huge. When our goal is 30 million young people into dignified and fulfilling work, that's a huge number. It's also just a drop in the bucket of the number of young people in Africa that are also looking for work. So we, are beholden to the fact that we have funds, but we have to make hard decisions about where is the best way to allocate these resources, and really truly listening to those that have much more of the answers than we do, and being steered in not just what we think is the best, but what our incredible partners are thinking, what young people are desiring, what the aspirations of young people are, and be directed in that way. So I don't have a real, answer of make sure you say this on your grant proposal to secure the funds, but I do think that shared vision, mission, and understanding of how to get there is really critical when you think about not just partnerships between those that are implementing, but also the partnership with those that are funding as well.
I love that, right? It's really connecting very well to what other members of the panel have said about choosing partners, is finding people who have shared values, who align goals. So clearly the partnerships is not just between the exchanging partners, but also with the funders. And again, then looking for that shared values. But Rocky, I wonder if you can bring some perspectives from your experience in looking for funding to support your program. How do you engage with funders to talk to them about why they should invest in a program like yours, which trains individuals, although the goal is larger for society, right? So how do you make that jump from investing in individuals for a longer term societal benefit?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And Ashley, I'm sorry, as soon as he asked the question, I was like, oh, let's wait and see what Ashley's going to say. But, funding is everything. I mean, a lot of it for me has been learning how to communicate with potential funders, right? I think in the little bit that you've heard me, I have a significant passion for what I do. I know in my head, I know exactly what emergency medicine and emergency medical systems development can mean to these populations. I know what it means here, right? And we have a lot of other support systems. And imagine what it could mean in a society where there's less support systems, to have a real foundation that creates a safety net, where all of a sudden, within a 5-year, maybe 6-year, 10-year course of time, a country can have emergency medical care, right? Like everybody there could have access to someone who knows exactly what they're doing. They've been specifically trained to do this thing. Imagine all the lives that we could save, and all the lives that we can improve, right? One of the things when I do the work, as I've matured in this process, and maturation for me is a hard thing, but as I've matured in the process, is trying to communicate, as Ashley said, trying to communicate a vision that is something that is shared by the foundation that we're trying to approach, right? If the foundation that we're approaching is really interested in children, right? They're like, children really want to make sure that the kids are being taken care of, and the children are getting the best of care. And I'm like, great. Every emergency department in Africa, or in Ghana, let me speak specifically, takes care of children. We take care of children. And the percentage of people who suffer life-altering injuries, who would go on to develop disability for the rest of their lives, happen in the age group that you're worried about, 14 to like 40, right? So at the lower end of that, those are the kids you're worried about, who, if they break their arm and there's nobody there to set it appropriately, they will no longer be able to use that arm for their full potential for the rest of their lives. If you invest in an emergency medical system, we'll have someone there who's trained well enough to set it appropriately, to get them to, and if they can't do it appropriately, we'll get them to the appropriate orthopedic surgeon who can do it, because they recognize it, right? Sometimes it's not about me fixing something, it's about me finding it soon enough and recognizing the potential badness if we don't get it fixed. So it's sort of not changing the message, but shaping and packaging the message, a portion of the overall message, in such a way that it's able to be absorbed by that foundation. Because not everybody, clearly, not every foundation is interested in capacity building, right? It's hard sometimes to go to them and be like, listen, there's this population here that you've never heard about, you don't even know anything about, and this thing that I'm going to do is going to give them a building block from which they can increase their GDP. Right? I've gone to some foundations about that, because if you look at growing a nation from like a low income country to the next level, low middle income, or middle income even, you have to have a large segment of your population reaching working age, working, right? So not only do they have to have, job availability, be able to fill those jobs, but they need to be healthy enough to get to that point and work. And if they're not working or not healthy enough to work, how do you increase your GDP? Right. So the same message is there. It's just, how do you package it in such a way that it can be absorbed by the foundation? I will tell you, it's been frustrating, because I've seen in the space, I've seen a lot of my colleagues have a lot of foundational money. And there's some who have foundation money to do emergency medical things in Ghana. Yet when I go to the places that they've been working on for 10 years, I'm like, wow, nobody here can say that the last 10 years have been any sort of improvement to them personally, much less to the system that is being created. So, if I would say anything to the foundations, and I try to, it's their money, they can do whatever they want with it, right? But what I always try to bring out is that, look at the work we've done in the little bit of time, like the impact that we've made, right? Like, I think it's behooves us to always bring to the foundations evidence, right? Because it's a nice idea. It's great. You want to help people, but what's the evidence? What's the impact that you've been able to make in the little bit of time that you've been doing this, or with the little bit of seed funding that you were able to receive?
Thank you, Rocky. And we are just about out of time. We have 1 minute left. So Moses, Ashley, and Enrica, I'm going to give each of you like 15 seconds to have a final say. Henrika.
Mine is less than that. Good universities and good places to do X can really be anywhere in the world, like emergency medicine in Kumasi, and institutions can learn from each other. So I think exchange programs can be the bridge between those 2 points and make them both happen.
Thank you. Moses, last words.
Yeah, I think just to say that what is critical is to build really good and long-term partnerships. And I think when you do that, you'll be able to achieve a lot of the results that you'd like to achieve, rather than the other way around, thinking more about just results, because then in the long term, I think you don't benefit much. So thanks, Andreas.
Thank you. And Ashley.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andreas, and to this entire panel. This was a joy to be on. I'll just quickly say, last week I was a part of a co-creation workshop where we had several African partners as well as North American partners. And in one of the plenaries, a question was posed: what would it take to create a truly equitable partnership? And how would we know if we succeeded in that? And some of the words that came out are, respect, dignity, recognition of power dynamics, truly valuing different knowledge systems, information systems, cultures, and the collective vision. And I just wanted to share that because, much more wisdom came from that conversation than I would ever espouse to have. But every time that I've seen something, a partnership work, it has all of those elements. And every time that I've seen a partnership go through some really deep challenges, it's because one or multiple of those values were not adhered to throughout the entire partnership. So that's something that we really keep in mind as we continue to build global partnerships in the future.
Thank you, Ashley. And that is kind of a perfect way in which to end this panel, which was about successful exchange programs. And Ashley just kind of articulated the core values that make these programs succeed. So thank you to our panelists and to everybody who participated. I'm really sorry that we didn't have time to get to more of the audience questions. Clearly, we should have made this a 3-hour-long discussion, although I think then we would have lost audience members because 3 hours is too long. So thank you for listening in. We will now have a 15-minute break, I believe a 15-minute break before our next session, which will start at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. That will focus on the reclamation and repatriation of African art. So take a break, stretch your legs, but please don't log out from the Zoom link because we will continue at the same link in 15 minutes. Thank you, Ashley, Henrika, Rocky, and Moses. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Africa Week. This session is on reclaiming and repatriating African heritage. It is our pleasure to welcome you here to the virtual University of Michigan. And I would like to just start by admitting that we struggled a little bit with the title of our panel because the R words mean a lot of different things to different people. When we think about repatriation, we often think about return, we think about restoration, sometimes we think about reparations, but what does this actually mean? And so that is part of what we are going to be discussing today. I would like to introduce our panelists. We have a distinguished group of people from around University of Michigan and from Africa. And I will start by introducing Chao Tayana Maina. She is a Kenyan digital heritage specialist and digital humanities scholar working at the intersection of culture and technology. Her work primarily focuses on the application of technology within African culture and heritage. She is the founder of African Digital Heritage, a co-founder of the Museum of British Colonialism, and a co-founder of the Open Restitution Africa Project. All of the resources that I've just mentioned are online resources and initiatives seeking to encourage a more critical, holistic, and knowledge-based approach to the design and implementation of digital solutions within African cultural heritage. Welcome, Chao Maina. Next, we have Professor Dr. Derek Peterson. He is a professor of history and African studies at the University of Michigan. He is the author or editor of several books, including The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin, Photographs from the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation, which was published this month. Peterson was awarded the MacArthur Genius Award in 2017. So I don't know about the rest of you, but now I'm really scared. So when I read that, I thought, I'm in the company of a genius. So the rest of us will just have to play along. For the past 10 years, Dr. Peterson has been working with Ugandan colleagues and U of Michigan students to organize, digitize, and circulate endangered archival materials. Thank you, Dr. Peterson, and welcome. Next, we also have Dr. Kelly Askew. She is professor of anthropology and Afro-American and African studies at the University of Michigan. She is author of Performing the Nation, Swahili Music and Cultural Politics in Tanzania, and co-director of the award-winning documentary film Maasai Remix. She received her PhD in anthropology from Harvard University. Welcome, Dr. Askew. We also have Dr. Paul Conway. He is a recently retired associate professor from U of M School of Information. His research and teaching interests encompass the digitization of cultural heritage resources, with a special focus on the complexities presented by audio and visual archives. Dr. Conway received his PhD in Library and Information Studies from the U of M. He is now Associate Professor Emeritus in the University of Michigan School of Information. His research and teaching have focused on archival science, digitization, and preservation of cultural heritage resources, and the ethics of new information technologies. His funded research projects at U of M have included developing a model of expert user interaction with large collections of digitized photographs, measuring the quality of large-scale digitization as represented in the Hathi Trust Digital Library, and understanding the complexities of providing digital access to collections of original live audio recordings, including the extensive recordings in the Leo Sarkeesian Music Time in Africa archive. I will stop there. Everyone has long and distinguished biographies, so let me introduce our final panelist, and welcome, Dr. Conway. Our last panelist that I will introduce is Dr. Siraj Rasool. He is a senior professor of history at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. He also teaches museum and heritage studies and curatorship. Among his latest publications are The Politics of Heritage in Africa, Economies, Histories, and Infrastructures, co-edited with his panelist, Dr. Derek Peterson and Kadzo Gavua. He's also published the Rethinking Empire in Southern Africa, which was co-edited with Dag Henrikstein, Giorgio Meischer, and Lorena Rizzo. Finally, he has also published more recently, a publication called Missing and Missed, Subject, Politics, Memorialization. I'm having trouble speaking this morning, apparently. Co-edited with Nikki Rousseau and Ridvan Musaj. He has served on the boards of the District 6 Museum and Iziko Museums of South Africa, as well as on the Human Remains Advisory Committee of the Minister of Arts and Culture. He has previously chaired the Scientific Committee of the International Council of African Museums and is a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Study of Physical Anthropology Collection, Felix van Luchan, at the Stedelijk Museum zu Berlin, Germany. Apologies for any mispronunciations. So welcome to all of our panelists. It is a pleasure that I am back at the University of Michigan, where I did my undergraduate degree in English, language and literature in the School of LS&A, and went on to get my Juris Doctor. And it's just a pleasure to be speaking and working on Africa with these distinguished colleagues. So for our first set of comments, I would like to turn to Dr. Siraj Rasool. Siraj, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel this evening for me, where I talk from Cape Town. And over the last 20 years or so, as part of my research on histories of collecting and on projects that seek to democratize museums in a society such as South Africa, which has been a kind of laboratory of transformation. I've gotten to do research on restitution. And this took me to understanding the history of human remains collecting in the Northern Cape and in the transfrontier region between South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia, that were really the first collections in the modern museum in South Africa. And these were illegally, unethically acquired human remains of bodies of Khoisan people that were disinterred, excavated from their graves, and taken into museums. And this research led to a book that got published many years ago called Skeletons in the Cupboard, that I did with my late colleague Martin Legassic, and that has gone on to have new life. In 2012, the findings of this book led to a restitution of the skeletons of Klaas and Troy Pienaar to be reburied at Kuruman, near where their corpses had been excavated from by the assistant to the Austrian physical anthropologist Rudolf Perch. And as a result of that research,
Dr. Rasool, let me just stop you for 1 second. Maybe just for our audience, you could describe who this person is and why are his remains so significant?
Okay, these remains were significant because they were part of a series of skeletons and corpses that were disinterred at the time for the purposes of racial study. This was the time when South Africa was becoming a nation, and South African museums and scientists were laying prior claim to having access to these remains. And as a result of that competition that South African scientists had with their European counterparts, we have an archive of this history of collecting, and where we can see the origins of the modern museum in South Africa. We can see the history of the South Africanization of science, and where what was also significant about the remains of Klaas and Troy Pienaar was that we were able to name the dead from the records of an inquiry. And not only that, we were able to ascertain that they were a married couple of farm workers on a farm, Pienaar Spits, where they had passed away of malarial fever. And at a time after the ending of apartheid, when you are transforming museums, when you are rethinking yourself as a nation, dead bodies have featured very strongly in the ways in which societies have reconfigured themselves. We only need to think about the war dead of the First World War. We need to think of the cemeteries of the dead and where the dead lies and how national narratives come to pertain to different categories of the dead. And the dead of racial science and are part of the process of deracializing and democratizing South African society. And the restitution that took place occurred through a methodology that the South Africans described as rehumanization. But one of the first times in the world that this took place, because our Austrian counterparts in the state and in the museum declared, when this demand was put on the table by the South Africans, that would not be possible under European law, that whatever is to be found in a museum has been rendered as an object, and as objects shall they be returned. And it was through the sheer skill of diplomacy that this restitution occurred as a rehumanization. And that idea of rehumanization has been pivotal and has gone on to influence returns elsewhere. And so my work has gone on to assist our German colleagues in their returns, in their debates through which science presents itself as being able to tell history from bones and want to hold on to the remains of the dead, of the colonial dead of racial science. And so the Germans have moved forward in many ways and are in the middle of a return of the remains of people collected by a research expedition from Rwanda. So there is a return of remains that had been collected by a Polish scientist by the name of Czekanowski that are being returned to Rwanda. Finally, I want to make one very important point, and this is in the light of the rise of the restitution debate in the last few years since the publication of the Savoir report in 2017 to Emmanuel Macron, since the publication a few months ago of the book, The Brutish Museums, by my colleague Dan Hicks of Pitt Rivers Museum, that establishes the extent to which museums were embedded in projects of colonial conquest, of expeditions of conquest, that museums were not just beneficiaries of conquest. Museums are brutal institutions that have created an aura and an ideology of care and humaneness. And it is very important for us to remember that human remains and material culture were collected as part of the very same expeditions. The very same researchers collected human remains, made sound recordings, made film recordings. And so we need to think of these different categories of collections, if you like, in the same breath, because we are at a stage of rethinking what we mean by museum. Museums have to be placed on a platform for an ethics of a new humanity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rasool. I think what you have said about what the meaning of a museum is and rethinking a museum as part and parcel of the brutal conquest, the colonial conquest, and the racialization of human remains. And I particularly appreciated your comments about restitution occurring through the rehumanization. And part of the success that you mentioned was diplomacy, which is my business. And so I think that this provides us with a way to link some of the work that all of you are doing and what diplomats can do in also furthering this cause. And I think we'll see this thread throughout the comments, and we'll pick up on some of this during the panel discussion. So thank you very much. Next, I would like to turn to Dr. Derek Peterson, who has also been working on digitization of the archives in Uganda. So Dr. Peterson, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to talk to this distinguished group of folks, some of whom are my colleagues, others of whom I very much have learned from over the course of time. I want to talk in a brief period of time here about work in which I've been engaged with Ugandan students and colleagues and with Michigan students and colleagues involving the rehumanization, as it were, of endangered government records in Uganda, in East Africa. In the late 2000s, that is in 2008-09, I started to work with a provincial university in Western Uganda called Mountains of the Moon University to address what seemed to us to be the pressing problem to do with preserving government records in the western part of the Republic of Uganda. This is the Kabarole District Archive, which was kept in the attic above the local government building. We started by bringing it and other district government archives into the campus of Mountains of the Moon University, which is located in Fort Portal in Western Uganda. The archives were cleaned up, put into order in a logical way, and then over the course of years, they were digitized using funds from the Center for Research Library, the Cooperative Africana Materials Project, and from the University of Michigan, with lots of resource also from MMU itself. Over the course of time, MMU has created a digital archive which consists of some 500,000 individual scans, making it the largest digitized repository of government documents in Africa. Access to that archive is only available to people who go to MMU in Western Uganda to consult it on a desktop computer. Alongside this work, I've been also collaborating with a number of provincial universities in Uganda to help organize paper archives in district government headquarters. So in 2013, we worked with Kabale University to organize the Kabale District Archive. In 2015, we worked with Busoga University in Eastern Uganda to rescue the Jinja District Archive, which was underwater at the time we arrived. We brought the files above ground, dried them out, and put everything in order, creating a catalog for the collection. This catalog and the whole collection is now available for research at the Uganda National Archives in Kampala. Most recently, I've been working with the judiciary of Uganda and with a number of Michigan students to organize and digitize the archives of Uganda's judiciary. We began working with the judiciary in 2018 to put in order its very extensive collection of case files and legal notes, which have been previously inaccessible both to court clerks, to litigants, and to researchers. The files were brought above to a working room, which you can see on the screen here, placed in order. The archives of the High Court of Uganda have now been organized, and we're working alongside Uganda archivists to render other collections accessible as well for researchers and students to use. Right at the moment, I'm working with colleagues at the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation to make accessible their very extensive collection of photographic, film, and radio materials. The UBC photo archive itself is kind of a wonder. It consists of some 70,000 photographic negatives made by government photographers in the 1950s through to the 1990s. Thus far, we've digitized some 40,000 out of those negatives. The most recent stage of this project just ended a few months ago when we digitized materials from the 80s and 90s. Alongside this work, we've also been working with the radio archive and with the film archive to render endangered material, that is decaying material, into different formats where it can be accessible and used in programming at UBC and for international broadcasting. Some of this material was put on display in a museum exhibition, which myself and my colleagues opened up at the Uganda Museum in May 2019. This exhibition was called The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin. It featured about 150 of the photographs which we had digitized from the UBC, alongside a selection of film and radio material, which we made available in the exhibition hall. The exhibition was on show for something close to 10 months, and thereafter we took it around to other parts of Uganda where it was accessible for other Ugandan audiences to see. The exhibition has been a great success in helping to promote discussion around Idi Amin's Uganda, a subject which has been largely closed for historical research and for political reflection in contemporary Uganda. Most recently, as Ambassador Page mentioned, myself and my colleague from Australia have edited a collection of these photographs and made them available as a book titled The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin. All of us involved in this work see it really as a means of making accessible materials that have been closed, of opening up conversations that have been in some sense shut off prematurely, of furnishing Ugandan citizens and researchers and students with materials with which to inquire into a past that's been in some sense inaccessible because of its the character of the material itself, and also because of the nature of Ugandan politics today, in which the current regime has been disposed against historical reflection altogether. Historical and archival work, in other words, is always political. It is a means of challenging a status quo. It's a means of empowering minority voices. It's a way of making possible futures, in some sense, actionable and visible. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Dr. Peterson, I think just the visual for me is the visual for me was so powerful. And I think this is another connection between the humanization as well as the historical reflection, the memorialization that Dr. Rasul talked about as well. And it's also a way that we can think about different narratives and who owns the narrative. And speaking of the ownership, I know that this has been a long discussion about the archives in different contexts, not just in Uganda, but elsewhere. And I think that that's something that is a recurring question about even the accessibility of some of the archives that you mentioned, only being available at one university in Uganda to those who know about it and can have access once they're there. And what does that mean for others who would like to know more about the Ugandan government at that time? So this is going to be yet another discussion and another theme that we're going to be talking about, especially as we turn next to Dr. Kelly Eskew and Dr. Paul Conway, who will talk about the digitizing of the Voice of America project that they have been collaborating on. So I turn it over to you two.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Page. Yes, we're going to move now from the realm of sight to the realm of sound. And thank you for the opportunity to introduce the work that we're doing with the Leo Sarkeesian Archive and its rare African music recordings that we believe deserve international access and appreciation, not to be left abandoned and forgotten in a government storage facility. Paul, my colleague, Paul Conway, and I will introduce the collection and say a few words about how our work relates to the challenges of restitution and repatriation of African heritage resources using digital technologies. Leo Sarkeesian, the man behind the Voice of America's show Music Time in Africa, had a big personality, a love for all forms of music and dance, and a passion for introducing African music to listeners throughout the world. A decorated World War II veteran of Armenian descent, Leo spent over a decade as a sound engineer, first with Tempo Records, a Hollywood-based production company that trained him to produce field recordings of music intended for film soundscapes. But then starting in 1958, he started traveling, Leo with his wife, Mary, through over 38 countries of then becoming newly independent African nations, creating a unique and rich collection of over 300 live field recordings. In 1963, legendary broadcaster Edward R. Murrow recruited Leo to join the Voice of America, the official broadcast agency of the United States government. Murrow charged Leo to help support radio stations in newly independent African nations. He trained African sound engineers, facilitating African-initiated music collection and archiving that continues to the present day. Leo always collaborated with local musical experts, such as Alhaj Siddiqui Diabate in Guinea, one of the most famous griots of the modern era, and Bai T. Moore, an assistant minister in the Liberian Ministry of Culture and founder of Liberia's National Cultural Center. In the collection are the first known recordings of Nigeria's Fela Kuti and Guinea's Bembeya Jazz, and the only known recording of Louis Armstrong performing in Africa at the 1967 Tunis Festival. Leo's fieldwork, his radio program, and his efforts to support the decolonization of African airwaves constituted a critical component of the Voice of America's communication strategy, simultaneously advancing the causes of African independence and also American political influence. In recent decades, scholars have attempted to grapple with and respond to the inequities and ethical dilemmas surrounding large collections of sound recordings that were taken, removed, and disappeared from local settings and collected, preserved, and hidden in archives far from their originating communities. These images on this slide show some of the efforts ongoing to return digitized recordings via community outreach, local performances, and even USB drives. However, barriers derive from the machine dependency of sound recordings in communities without reliable electricity, ICT infrastructure, and access to the internet.
Music Time in Africa is the longest and running and most popular radio show from the Voice of America. The first broadcast of Music Time in Africa was in May 1965 from Monrovia, Liberia. The timing of the 30-minute weekly program attracted listeners across sub-Saharan Africa just prior to a major 2-hour news broadcast on Sunday evenings called African Panorama. Music Time in Africa was and continues to be a highly choreographed and fully scripted performance of intertwined words and music. Beginning with the first program, Leo assembled musical selections by stringing together recordings drawn from the extensive collections in the program's music library, some 10,000 tapes and recordings of in all media. Leo worked exclusively with quarter-inch magnetic tape, ripping selections from 45 RPM singles or LPs. He also extracted excerpts from his live field recordings and from the recordings sent to him by radio stations in Africa. A series of very talented and increasingly popular announcers performed the scripts around selections cut into the program at specifically timed intervals. The hosts projected a personal interest in the listener experience while crediting Leo Sarkeesian for the intellectual content. The show's messaging has always been immensely popular with African audiences, as evidenced by the nearly 1,000 fan letters that the show received every month. Leo and his wife, Mary, faithfully responded to most of these letters for 4 decades, enclosing signed photographs, calendars, and program schedules. Host Rita Rochelle inspired at least one fan club in Nigeria, and she traveled with Leo in Africa in the 1980s on several of his many return visits. The project website for Music Time in Africa, the URL for which is below in this slide, includes a custom-built online platform that by later this year will provide direct access to nearly 1,100 radio shows, as well as faceted metadata browsing and full-text search of program scripts. For the first 30 years of the show, broadcast from the first 30 years, broadcasts from 1966 to 1996 are available now through this interface. Plans for this year include releasing broadcasts from 2000 to 2017 and the majority of Leo's 360 original field recordings. The fundamental challenge in repatriating recordings of radio broadcasts is the borderless, disembodied nature of radio itself. Much of the material included in Music Time in Africa is orphaned in the ontological, if not the legal sense of the term. For this project, our approach is to return or repatriate African music to Africa through rebroadcasting Music Time in Africa through the open internet, and by collaborating with the Voice of America to reach the vast current audience of the radio show. More than a million listeners have log Music Time in Africa through various media right now. It's still an active program. As a safety measure, we're prepared to use well-established takedown procedures developed at the University of Michigan to respond to situations where resistance arises from releasing individual musical selections. So that's our presentation for today. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eskew and Dr. Conway. This is really an interesting notion of repatriation through rebroadcast. And I know that we've touched on some of the legal issues about what that means and how to go about that, is going to be an ongoing issue. I think the rights of the original artists and their descendants, along with the rights of the broadcaster themselves. But this is where I think we can have a very good transition to Chaumaina, because she will talk about the significance of the data and what we can do with that. So I will turn it over to Chaumaina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Susan. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here with you today and to speak alongside such fantastic projects. And today I'll be speaking about Open Restitution Africa, which is a project started by my colleague Molemo and I. It's an Africa-led project seeking to open up access to information on the restitution of African material culture and human ancestors, with the aim of empowering all stakeholders to make knowledge-based decisions. So I've talked about what the project is, but why do we need this project? And I'll briefly speak about how we started it. My colleague Molemo and I met at a conference in 2019 in Namibia. And this conference brought together African practitioners working within museums particularly, and some who are working within restitution. And we were both very encouraged to see and hear about what's happening in Namibia, in South Africa, in Angola. But what we also noticed is that this data and this information was largely invisible. So therefore, it seemed like a lot was happening. But when you look online, when you try to find data, when you try to understand who is working on what, it was very hard to find this information. And this really became the impulse for Open Restitution Africa. This being the lack of information available to African practitioners or interested parties who want to work on restitution, whether it's within debates, policy, and practice. And because of this lack of data, it's very difficult for us to observe trends, to understand shifts, to understand what's happening, but also to enable more people to operate from a place of knowledge. And the other thing about the lack of data is, and this lack of visibility, particularly of African practitioners, is that the debate seems that it's largely dominated by European voices. So the project in essence seeks to remedy this lack of representation of African voices by enabling a very in-depth and data-driven debate on restitution for Africans by Africans. And in this way, particularly being very deliberate about highlighting the experience, complexities, and needs of African practitioners. And to speak particularly on the issue of complexities, I think one of the things that's come up a lot when we're doing this project is the issue of that African practitioners are dealing with much more than just the act or return or the process of restitution itself. You know, there's a lot of emotional labor involved, psychological, intellectual labor, there's politics, there's hierarchical relationships that we're dealing with. And just to use the words of Njoki Ngumi, who is a Kenyan practitioner, she says that we have to accept that our unrest is valid and we should pay attention to it. So the complexities, in essence, are a big part of the process. And while it might seem that, you know, European practitioners can treat restitution as a 9-to-5 job, for many African practitioners, this is a lived experience. You know, separating restitution from your lived experience as a child or as an adult in your country and how you engage with your culture is nearly impossible. So what does open restitution look like practically? The project seeks to gather data on restitution, current restitution processes across the African continent, and serve as a sort of like a centralized portal of case studies and best practice examples, and therefore encourage, as I had mentioned, data-informed and very in-depth conversation. So some of the things we want to map out in terms of digital data are things like completed returns, what's pending, what's best practice, what are the policy and advocacy approaches towards restitution on the continent, but also have something like a specialist or restitution practitioner centralized database. So if you're looking for someone who's working on restitution in Angola, you should be able to find it. If you're looking for what's happening in Kenya or people to talk to, you should be able to have access to that. And I think the other thing is when we talk about opening up this data on restitution, it's not just about facts and figures. The way we envision it essentially is that opening up this data is also about the human data, the human experience and the experiences of African practitioners. And to this end, we've been hosting a series of public discussions and public webinars called Restitution Dialogues, in a way that we're trying to make this as accessible to both specialist and non-specialist audiences. And I think when I reference one of the webinars we spoke to El Hadj Malik Ndiaye from Senegal, and he said that sometimes it feels like we're moving in circles. We keep asking the same questions and addressing the same issues, and therefore we're not able to understand the progress or measure it in whether it's metric or qualitative terms. So the project is essentially grounded on research. It's an experiment, as I said, and where we have two strands of research. There's restitution research, focusing on restitution data, and then there's open data research. Some of the research questions we have are what kind of data do African practitioners need? What are they currently relying on to drive restitution requests? In what ways do these current sources of data strengthen or impede the restitution process? What kind of data or information would be of value to institutions and practitioners, particularly those involved within the restitution projects? And what are some of the viable digital systems or strategies for centralizing and sharing this data on restitution? So lastly, and I think just to speak to the issue of it being a public discussion, I think open restitution, both my colleague and I truly believe that open restitution is committed to the principle that more transparency and openness and access to information in clear, easy to understand language can enable a more nuanced discussion among different stakeholders within the restitution debate, whether it's public audiences or museum practitioners or policymakers. Just to look at some of the data that we've had from our webinar series online, in 6 months, we had almost 2,000 views. But what was interesting was that over 80% of the audience was between 25 to 35, and 78% of the audience were women. And I think this speaks largely to restitution also and the groundwork of this cultural work being done mostly by women, whereas the higher you go, it's more male-centric. So open restitution, it really is an approach and allowing us to define both in contemporary times what restitution means to us as a younger generation of Africans, but also as people who want to unpack the cultural and hierarchical emotional power complexities that African practitioners have to face every day when dealing within this subject. And we keep saying that it's a reality that we live in. It's an everyday experience. Restitution is not something that we choose to cast aside. It informs so many of our decisions and how we move and engage with our culture. So we understand essentially and look at restitution as an opportunity, and the belief and an attempt to open up this data and encourage a more critical understanding of what it means to change how we see museums, as Siraj spoke about, this being a chance to really redefine and question what museums represent and how they are founded in terms of ethics and rehumanization, but also the point that data is a crucial part of this discussion, and the availability and accessibility of data is very crucial. So thank you very much, and yeah, looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much. So I think everyone can see that we have a fantastic group of panelists who have immense experience in data collection, digitization, and restitution. I would like to focus our conversation to get started on the idea of what a museum is and how do museums, how can they both hold onto ideas of the past or serve as evidence of the past, and how at the same time can those voices that are often unheard, the lived experiences as Chao Maina spoke about and Dr. Rasul, how do we get those voices out there? It's not that they're not there, we know that. We know that Africa has the youngest population of all of the continents right now. And there's clearly a hunger just from what you're saying about the number of people who attended the restitution dialogues, the webinars and whatnot, especially with the number of women. But how do we make it so that the lived experiences are not re-traumatizing? And how should we start thinking, what is the current thought about remaking of a museum? So maybe I'll turn first to Siraj, but I do want this to be a conversation between all of you. So Dr. Rasul, why don't you kick us off? And maybe Ms. Maina, you can then comment, because you've been working on these different museums as a co-founder, and what that means from your perspective. So Dr. Rasul?
Thank you so much, Ambassador Page, and thank you very much to all my co-panelists for their presentations. We are very honored. It's an enormous privilege for us to be living at a very peculiar time in the transformation of what we mean by museum. We are the products of, and we live inside of, the museum as a regulatory institution of governmentality that regulates the relationship between things and people. But the museum also came into existence at a time that coincided with colonization. So the museum came into existence not just as a collecting institution, but as an epistemological institution. The museum is marked by an order of knowledge and classification. And one of the major boundaries that obtained in the modern museum is the boundary between the civilized and the uncivilized, between those who required uplift and those that were on a path of cultural history and civilization. And this is a model of museum that you find in the United States. You find it in Europe, and a lot of the debates that have been taking place have been about what we call the ethnographic museum or the ethnological museum. A very peculiar kind of museum that we have very cuddly, fuzzy feelings of care about. And obviously, lurking in the background of this conversation is a history of disciplines and how these disciplines have reckoned with their relationship with colonialism. But this reckoning is of a different nature in different societies. And on the African continent, ethnographic museums have been oppressive institutions. They are institutions that regulate our people as members of races and tribes. And they depict society through the idea of the peopling of Africa, based on anthropology's old ideas. And so this is a museum where our people do not recognize themselves. And so they've become old, faded, dusty spaces where school children are trafficked through by obligation, and where the hard-working curators or keepers and staff are so weighed down by the ideology of the museum that it's a space of conservation and a space of care. And so nothing changes because you don't touch things and you leave them in the state that they are. And the concept of museum has such authority that it must be true, it must be correct. And so in place of that, you've got such enormously interesting new understandings of museum that have emerged in Latin America and on the African continent. The District 6 Museum in Cape Town is a more famous example of one such museum. But the project that is led by Chow and her colleagues on the Museum of British Colonialism, the digital project that has just intervened in the way we understand not just what colonialism or what colonialism did in Kenya, but also on what is possible in rethinking the work of the museum. Because the old museum was a museum that did citizenship in a way where everyone was meant to know their place in the divide of the civilized and the uncivilized. What we want is a museum of critical citizenship, where people recognize themselves, where people are encouraged to do social criticism, where people are encouraged to question everything around them. And restitution, it offers us an enormous opportunity for African societies, but also for the societies that were the recipients of the artifacts acquired under conditions of violence and under colonialism's enduring violence. An opportunity
that's
to rethink
excellent.
What a museum is.
Okay, so let me ask Chow, would you like to comment on that or just add to that? Because I want to get the other panelists as well to comment on some of their work and how that might feed into or be a response to what the new museum could be.
Absolutely. Just to add into what Siraj has said about how do you approach an institution that was originally designed to exclude you, and there's a lot of weight with coming to that space, even as a child or as whether you're working in the space or visiting the space. There's a lot of emotional weight and labor that we don't understand, or we try and most of the time discount, that really feeds into the museum experience. And I think for us, looking at what a new museum would look like, I think it would be a very active thinking of history as an active process, as something we do, as something we find, as something we go out and do, not something that we receive, which is what we were taught, that we sit down in school and we learn and then we leave. But saying actually, history is about documentation, it's about new forms of archiving, it's about new representation, and the museum being a space that facilitates that, encourages that, and creates that opportunity for dialogue and understanding of empathy, openness, vulnerability, the things that are lacking, the humanity that is lacking within the space, to infuse it once more and to infuse it with the very deliberate intention to empower those who visit the space to do something of their own in different capacities. Yeah.
So that's a good point. So in envisioning for oneself the museum, let me turn to Dr. Peterson, because the work that you've done in Uganda has actually run into some complications with the government, as far as I understand. Could you talk about that and the pushback that you received when wanting to open up that access, not for yourself or the West, but for Ugandans themselves to have access to that, even taking around the film of Idi Amin, the unseen, the hidden archives?
Yeah, I mean, look, as Siraj knows, as Dr. Rasool knows, it's not only curators who are reluctant to revise museum collections and to dispense with the ethnographic criteria that by which so many collections in African institutions are set up. Ethnography is, among other things, a way of suppressing conflict. It's a way of making history, controversy invisible, of kind of covering over trauma, of making everything seem to be about culture and tradition and ancestorship and patriarchy and consensus. All these values are upheld by the tourist industry, they're upheld by the heritage business, they're upheld by governments that wish to suppress real investment in history in the way that Chao discusses, at the expense, in a way of effectively of making it possible for citizens of their country to disregard inherited traumas and to see themselves instead as faithful followers of people in power. In other words, the Ethnographic Museum is a machine not just for the uplifting of colonial histories, but it's also extremely potent as a means of organizing politics today in many African societies, like in Uganda, and like many other places in Eastern and Southern Africa. The Ethnographic Museum's longevity is not just a holdover from the colonial past, it's also a continuing vehicle for the creation of a kind of form of state-led political consensus. So undoing that entails, as you said, Ambassador, a great amount of political advocacy. In the Ugandan instance, we had a brief opening to put together a historical exhibition, which both Dr. Rasool and Chao Maina were able to attend happily, where we were able to put on display materials that invited Ugandans to look at the 1970s anew. Whether that opening will still be there in the future is a very difficult question to know. There's a shift in some sense in the current government's view of the past, a brief moment of openness toward historical reflection in a political order which more generally has been disposed to regard the history of Uganda as a kind of closed subject, as a matter that's uninteresting, unworthy of pursuit, and therefore something that well-intentioned people ought to simply ignore or forget. Forgetting history, forgetting political history, as I mentioned, is an extremely useful vehicle for encouraging a kind of consensus in Uganda as in many other places. Kenya's grappling with the history of the 1950s does strike me as something that's to some extent unique in Eastern and Southern Africa, actually, thinking about the work that you and your colleagues have done, Chao, in the Museum of British Colonialism. There's been a kind of convergence of legal and political will in Kenya to encourage the pursuit of justice, historical justice for traumatized, violated, abused people in Mau Mau detention camps. That convergence of political interests and historical reflection strikes me as something that's quite particular about the Kenyan case, actually.
Well, this is an interesting commentary, because while it certain kinds of histories may be politically difficult to even renounce our hold on, but maybe Dr. Eskew and Dr. Conway, I think one of the differences that music maybe makes it easier in some ways because it speaks a sort of different language. But maybe I'm mistaken. I mean, we have at US embassies, part of our cultural diplomacy is we send musicians, artists, painters, poets, every phase of art around the world to showcase Americanism and part of American culture, even though that culture that we are showcasing around the world is a mix of cultures. Of course, that's part of the hodgepodge of the melting pot of the United States. But does it make it easier, not in the legal concept, but maybe easier with the authorization of digitization of music archives versus historical, even though of course the music is historic as well?
Well, let me start by addressing some of the concerns that my colleagues, my esteemed and wonderful colleagues, have raised about the problematic past of museums in Africa and ethnography, the tool of anthropology, which is my discipline, very much part and parcel of violent histories. That's certainly true. There's no denying that. At the same time, anthropology has been at the forefront of trying to engage with ordinary citizens and a sort of grassroots looking upwards perspective on how people perceive their nations, their politics, their cultures. And so as opposed to the top-down versions that historians, political scientists, and others have tended to privilege. So this music collection is unusual because it's ordinary people's voices. Yes, you do have the stars, you do have the Fela Kuti and the Babaya Jazz recordings, but the vast majority of these recordings are of ordinary Africans producing their own musical perspectives on life. Not only that, the archive itself, one aspect of it that we didn't get to talk about is that not only is it composed of the radio shows, which are immense in number, and the original field recordings done by either Leo or the African sound engineers he trained at Radio Tanzania, Radio Douala, Radio Ghana. It also comprises cassette recordings that listeners would send in with their fan letters. Mm-hmm. So there's this grassroots component to it as well, where people wanted their music featured on the show. They wanted to share the pride with which they wanted to promote their own culture, their own music, is also a piece of this archive that has no building attached to it. How do you deal with music, with a collection that is not in the historic museums that we've been talking about in the other three contexts, but is a perfectly movable object, digitized object now? And to that, maybe Paul can add.
Yeah, please, Paul.
Right. I've focused more, Kelly has focused on the underlying music that Leo collected or Leo recorded himself. In our partnership, my focus has been on the distinctive nature of an international radio broadcast, and the dissolution of borders, at least from the Voice of America's perspective, the very conscious attempt to cross borders, to cross tribal affinities, to cross the notion of an emergent nation, and to see how music can. We use the term music diplomacy, a kind of neutral. We know it's not neutral, but the philosophy of Music Time in Africa and the way it played out was to build on the neutrality of the shared interest of rhythm, of dance, of instruments that may be named one thing by one peoples and named something else, but it produces the same sound. And so this kind of community of interest in music was the philosophy of Leo and the Music Time in Africa. But behind that was the Voice of America, making sure that America's voice, America's perspective, America's competition with the Soviet Union was a kind of underlying, never overt. That's why I think what Suraj is talking about by surfacing the messaging that is hidden in what seems like a benign idea of a museum, or the benign idea of a music program, is worthy of it's worthy of digging deeper into the messaging, and how juxtaposition serves as a kind of peacemaking exercise, but also it's a stance. It's a stance about how people should behave toward each other. And I think Leo was one of the most benign, loving people we've ever encountered, but the Voice of America has its own agenda, and Leo is part of that agenda for Music Time in Africa. So there's a lot of work that can be done on digging beneath the surface of what appears to be a peacemaking operation, and where it may not be quite quite so simple. And the evidence for that, I'll share just very quickly. The evidence for that is in the radio programs themselves. Any given script is subject to exploration. We've done a lot of work to tease out who the performers are and how they've been juxtaposed. But there's a lot of room for exploring how these programs served as a kind of music diplomacy with both a kind of loving, caring perspective, but also a U.S. power, the U.S. power relationship as it's broadcast, as it's played out through sub-Saharan Africa. So there's everything is a double-edged sword, and these programs have the same power to serve as a political investigative tool.
So this actually gets us back to Dr. Rasul's first point of democratization. And of course, that was the nature of, well, the Voice of America, maybe not so much democratization, but at least to try to have countries not go the route of communism. Mm-hmm. But as you mentioned, of course, that's a political dynamic as well. So let me just ask the last question, which because there are a couple of questions in the queue that I want us to get to, and I think that this will link the question that I first saw. When we talk about music being kind of music diplomacy or shared interest through rhythm and dance, music was also very political. And a lot of songs were written to portray or demonstrate, to illustrate a message that maybe they could not speak outwardly, but they could express either through a language that was unknown or not widely spoken by whoever was at the top of the political power landscape, be that under colonialism or even afterwards. And also when we talk about them not being, that the music was kind of shared across borders, across tribes and ethnicities, et cetera. But of course, that's an artificial importation anyway of colonialism because they weren't divided beforehand. So I'm not sure if to say that it's, in that sense, democratization through music, I'm not sure that that's, I understand what you're saying and the complexities. So let me ask the question that is in the queue. So coming from the second most populated African nation, this is from Ethiopia. When my father was a 6th grade student, it was 22 million. When I was the same grade, it was 42 million. Today, the conservative estimate is over 112 million. How do we scholars successfully push back the reluctance of African states and societies in convincing the urgency of museums and cultural heritage? So I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that. Because that's a little bit difficult. Maybe this could be asked alongside with what I've been thinking of is 2 aspects, which is the items, which of course, as many of you have mentioned, can include physical remains, human remains of people that are in museums, without the knowledge or authorization of family members, et cetera. But it can also be objects that were taken, that were looted, that were stolen. What does that say about the museums of, for instance, the new Museum of African and American Cultural Heritage in Washington, D.C.? The power of taking ownership of the materials, but they're still the same harmful, hurtful objects that also enslaved people. Does that make a difference? Because is it rewriting the trauma? And would that convince that kind of ownership of your own museum make it different in terms of the repatriation or the restitution, taking the power back? Does that link maybe to the questioner's question? Go ahead, Dr. Russell.
Try to address different aspects of your presentation. I mean, one of the problems of changing museums in different African societies is the model of the museum that we have tends to be a statist one. Is one that is very intimately connected into the operation of ministries of arts and culture, ministries of education, ministries of science and technology, in which museum directors and curators are state employees. And sometimes they are members of the state. And unfortunately, statist museums are a recipe for the reproduction of museums as oppressive institutions. We need to enable, African governments need to have the confidence to enable museums to be enabling environments. So, and that obviously museums are going to be governed. It involves resources, money from the state, but that doesn't mean that museums are instruments of the state, that museums are instruments to tell certain kinds of stories. In some ways, museums, for some governments, pose a kind of threat, because too much democracy and too much questioning is not necessarily in everyone's interests. But I think restitution offers an enormous opportunity for renewal, for rethinking. It takes a commitment from governments. It's going to take a commitment from regional East, West, Southern and North African bodies. It's an opportunity for us to enable restitution to become a platform for rethinking the relationship between museum and community. And it's an opportunity for us to focus on a museum as bringing together the resources and energies of activists and curators and community members and forms of knowledge that enter into a relationship with each other, in which, as our colleague Ray Silverman would put it, and as some of us have argued in the past, rethinks the museum as a process of knowledge making, and in which requires the involvement of the broadest layer of people as possible, and that invites debate, that invites dispute, and this is vital. And states also have to realize that museums are not just institutions to showcase the society for tourists, or places where school kids can go for some form of education. Museums are vital institutions for the intellectual and cultural health of the society. Museum is central in the way in which people think about themselves, and museums must be busy places, and they must be busy on all platforms, in real time, online, and in all these different ways that we can rethink museum, not just as an architecture, or it's not a building, it's not just a collection, but that it's an enabling environment in which we actively dispel all the myths created by colonialism.
Thank you. That's good. Let me turn to Derek, Dr. Peterson, and then I'm just going to need to start wrapping it up.
No, just very briefly, I think all that Siraj has to say is enormously attractive. On the other hand, I just, as a historian, want to say that there's a limit to what museums can do. Repatriation, which both Chow and Siraj have pursued in a variety of formats, is a tremendously valuable ethical position to take for museum curators and a point of action for curators in the Global South to pursue. But it is worth saying that the place where colonial governments did the work of governing African peoples was also in archives, through the creation of paperwork, through bureaucracy, through the administration of the law. Paper archives in particular have apparently fallen outside the kind of museological focus on repatriation as a kind of concern, an ethical position, a project. And I take everything that Suraj says about what museums can do, but I also would say that a vigorous historical culture enabled by investments in government archives in African societies would richly enable democratic dialogue in a way that I'm afraid museums aren't equipped to do, because the whole museological format itself is a kind of a one-way format that in some sense disables the kind of disagreeable, disputatious work of holding people accountable for what they've done in the past. That's the work that can be done through legal and political investigations into archives.
So we have sort of two last questions that I think we can combine before we close for very quick, rapid response. So one question, I think these can be combined. So when we talk about the movement of physical objects, what about horizontal movement? So many locations where history has been made, they're built upon older cultures. So who makes the decision about which layer is the one that we expose? And the next question that I just very quickly want is there a role for the private sector to support the development, promotion, and maintenance of museums in Africa? So what's the nexus between the museums and the business community, if at all? And could this help to get us around the retain and explain rather than restitution approach that some governments, museums, et cetera, are taking? Let's just go quickly around the panel. So I'll start with Dr. Askew because you're first on my screen. Everyone gets a quick shot of a rapid response to any or all parts of those.
So in terms of the layering question, I guess that the point of discovery is to explore all the layers and their relationships to each other. So that's the work again of archaeologists, historians, and other scholars working on the past. As for movement across, was that the second one?
Yeah.
We're talking about three different kinds of institutions. One, the museum. Secondly, the archive in Africa. And then third, what we've been working with, an archive outside of Africa of African objects. But of course, Dr. Rasool's working on that also with the repatriation restitution work in Europe. I think there are three different kinds of institutions that therefore raise different kinds of questions as to how they can be repurposed and rethought of in terms of the needs that society has today. Because I agree 100% with Dr. Rasool that creating cultural citizens who are critical is really the end goal.
Great, thank you. Okay, Ciao, Maina, you're next on my screen.
I'll just speak very briefly to the question of supporting museums in the private sector. I think definitely there is a lot that can be done, but also in the sense that there are many people working on the periphery of the museum sector to support the museum sector. So projects such as ours, or what partnerships such as Derek's are doing is supporting the museum sector, but also enabling those working on the periphery to build systems that strengthen the museum and either challenge or provide access to data. So I think strengthening the museum, but also exploring what's happening on the periphery of the sector, who is interfacing with the sector, and what support do they need could also be a different approach that could be helpful. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Dr. Peterson.
I think I've said much about what I want to say about this, except simply to flag up that in a context in which we often think of digitization as a means of enabling the flow of materials across spaces and enabling access and democracy, particularly here at Michigan with its investment in Google Books and such. It's worth saying that open access itself in political contexts like Uganda is deeply controversial. The reason, to go back to the question you asked me earlier, Ambassador Page, about why researchers and students can't access the digitized archives that I've worked with in Uganda, except by going to Western Uganda to access it on a desktop computer, is quite simply that Uganda's government doesn't allow government documents to leave the country for reasons that I actually find quite reasonable. That there's a kind of way in which the overlap between open access and accessibility is heralded in the global north as a means of encouraging, accountability, but it's also a kind of data mining. It enables the expropriation of digitized assets from the global south to the global north, particularly in a context where bandwidth is expensive, hard to get hold of, where there's not the same machinery to allow access in places like Uganda or Kenya. Digitization is not, in fact, a path toward the democratization of knowledge or the open flow of information, those sorts of things. It, in fact, is another way, I'm afraid, in which global Northerners are able to access materials to their own advantage as scholars and researchers and journalists in a way that doesn't correspondingly promote the work of people in the global South.
Great.
Dr.
Conway,
add
yes.
two sentences on Derek's. The profit motive of businesses is another issue that's complicating the matters. The partnerships between private and public may get a lot of material digitized, but private partnerships may foster a new kind of enclosure or restriction that is not just government-led, but also profit. But the profit motive drives it as well. So there's some real advantages, but we have to be very careful about the partnerships we make.
Siraj, if you could be really, really brief, because we need to close.
I mean, I don't think we should drive a wedge between what we call museum and what we call archive. These are collecting institutions. Archives are not just historians' institutions. They're institutions of making publics, of producing publics. And that's work that we've been doing in the South African History Archives for many years. And this is about rethinking, archives and archivalisms as projects, as activist projects, in the same way as we rethink what we mean by museum. These are opportunities for us with all these collecting institutions. Digitization is absolutely vital. They add to the ways in which to access to the government of things, but we also need to think about ways in which these kinds of institutions are put to work in imagining new societies.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists, our esteemed panelists from Kenya, from University of Michigan, and from South Africa. Thank you all so much for this really enlightening discussion. I encourage the audience who maybe didn't get their questions answered or answered sufficiently, please go online and look up the panelists. They have extensive writing, and I'm sure you will find great ways to connect with them. So it is my pleasure at this time to give them a round of applause virtually. And thank you all very much for all of this food for thought. So let me now do our final introduction, which is to turn it over to Dr. Mary Gallagher. She is the director of the International Institute here at the University of Michigan. Dr. Gallagher. And thank you, panelists.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, everyone, for this great panel. I wanted to, since I'm closing out the last day of the first part of the conference, to thank everyone here, my colleagues at the University of Michigan, for participating and for hosting all of the speakers and doing such a great job with the technology. As the director of the International Institute with which the African Studies Center is affiliated, I'm really gratified to see this remarkable collection of scholars, of policymakers, of leaders in other fields discussing the opportunities and challenges of education, technology, public health in Africa. I was also the director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, for many years. And I'm also very interested as a scholar of China in how China's domestic transformation is expanding its global footprint, and particularly its large and growing presence in Africa. The International Institute, of course, is the overarching unit that binds together these different centers with their area studies focuses. But I hope that the II can do more to bridge the gap between centers to facilitate more cross-regional and cross-center collaboration. We also have thousands of Chinese students and scholars on U of M's campus, and we can play a really important role, not just in educating our US students, our domestic students, but international students to be leaders in all of these fields. We've already partnered with the Ford School of Public Policy and the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, as well as the African Studies Center, to launch workshops on China, Africa, and on China's growing role in international development. So I'm hoping that that will be something that we will continue to foster in the future. I have a couple of notes about the coming days with the co-located workshops. Most importantly, they are beginning at 8 a.m. instead of 8:30, so 8 a.m. Eastern Standard. These workshops will include Africa-US STEM collaborations, the business of healthcare in Africa, war dramas in cross-cultural contexts, data science for better health in Africa, and COVID-19 countering disinformation. Thursday will also feature a special discussion on the challenges associated with distributing the COVID-19 vaccines in Africa. The conversation will be with doctors Tachi Yamada, Paul Farmer, and Sanait Fasea, who are all good friends to U of M and to the newly established Center for Global Health Equity. To mark the last day of the main conference, I'd like to thank everyone who participated and who helped to organize. It was a really remarkable convening power of a university like Michigan to bring together this group, alumni, friends, faculty, students, and partners from across the globe, and in particular Africa, for a series of important conversations. We look forward to watching many of the ideas that were discussed and shaped this week take flight in the months and years ahead. And we particularly encourage people who are not at Michigan to continue to stay connected. We are a better community and a more impactful university because you contribute your ideas and enthusiasm to our campus. We encourage you to support our students, our faculty, our staff, and our programs, and particularly the UMAPS program, the U of M Africa Presidential Scholars Program, and all the good work that it does. Please visit our website for more information about the coming days in the conference. And again, starting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Thank you so much.